What if history didn't shout, but whispered? Tonight, we're drifting to ancient Egypt where the Nile keeps time, temples wake with incense, and scribes teach breath to live on paper. No battles, no noise, just slow boats, soft lamps, and the kindly rhythm of everyday life. Set your phone face down, loosen your shoulders, and listen for the river. We'll start at dawn on the water, follow quiet footsteps into village courtyards, and end beneath a sky that still knows all the old names of the stars. If your mind wanders, that's perfect. Let it move like the current and come back whenever it likes. Before we begin, a small favor. If peaceful journeys through the past help you rest, please subscribe to my channel. It tells the algorithm to keep your nights gentle and it helps me make more episodes just like this. Ready, breathe in. The boats are untied. The Nile is waiting. When people speak of ancient Egypt, they often recall the great pyramids, the solemn temples, or the stern gaze of statues that have survived millennia. Yet beneath and before all of that grandeur, there was something simpler, quieter, and more constant. It was the Nile. The river did not rush like a mountain torrent nor disappear into desert sand as lesser streams did. It moved with patience, with dignity, as though it understood that an entire civilization leaned upon its shoulders. To live in Egypt was to live in rhythm with the Nile. Its waters were not merely useful. They were the very breath of the land. At dawn, the river's surface would glimmer with light that had traveled across deserts and mountains before pausing here, on waters so calm they seemed half asleep. Reeds bowed gently, catching the breeze that had drifted down from distant Ethiopian highlands. Fishermen launched their narrow boats with quiet pushes, the wood creaking softly as if reluctant to disturb the hush. Nets were cast in graceful arcs, their descent into the water sounding like a sigh. Birds skimmed across the surface, wings barely brushing the current. But the river was more than morning beauty. It was the timekeeper of Egypt. Each year, when Sirius the star Egyptians called Soptetros just before dawn, it signaled the coming inundation. The floodwaters would spill across the fields, not with violence, but with patience, carrying silt that turned the ground dark and fragrant. It was a rhythm older than kings, older than temples, older than memory itself. For centuries upon centuries, people waited for that swelling, knowing their lives depended on its loyalty. The inundation was not feared, it was welcomed. Children would run to the edges of the fields to watch the waters creep forward, covering furrows, swallowing paths, turning the earth into a shallow mirror of the sky. Farmers smiled, not because the flood was dramatic, but because it was trustworthy. In the hush of evening, as the waters spread, families would sit together and speak of harvests yet to come. Stories were told of past floods, of years generous and years lean, of how the river was both stern and merciful. When the waters withdrew, they left behind soil black and rich. Farmers pressed seeds into that softened ground, sometimes barefoot, feeling the damp earth squeeze gently between their toes. Barley and emmer wheat were sown in lines that mirrored the flow of the river itself, straight, simple, and enduring. Irrigation channels, dug with patient effort, extended the Nile's gift further into the fields. Water flowed from ditch to furrow, guided not by machines but by hands and memory. Each small stream sang the same quiet refrain, life, life, life. The Nile also carried people. Boats laden with grain drifted northward with the current, sails catching the southward winds. For the return, the river was the road that needed no paving, the messenger that never tired. Barges carried not just food but stone for temples, wood for roofs, and papyrus for the scribes who filled Egypt's memory with words. Along the banks, towns rose like beads strung on a necklace, each village connected by the thread of water. Religion, too, was braided into the river's flow. Hymns praised Happy, the Nile god, not with fear but with gratitude. He was seen not as a fierce deity demanding sacrifices, but as a benevolent presence who arrived faithfully, year after year, bringing plenty. Priests watched the river carefully, noting levels on millimeter stone stairways carved into the banks to predict the abundance or scarcity of the harvest. Their announcements echoed through the land, shaping taxes, tithes, and offerings. Yet life with the Nile was not all ritual and duty. It was also a collection of small, ordinary moments. Children splashed in shallow pools left behind by the retreating flood. Women rinsed linen, beating it gently against flat stones, the rhythmic sound blending with bird calls. Fishermen returned with baskets heavy with catch, scales glinting in the sunlight. Herdsmen led cattle down to drink their shadows, stretching long in the evening light. At night, the river became a mirror for the heavens. Stars scattered themselves upon its surface, trembling with the faintest ripple. Families gathered near the banks, the air filled with the smell of damp earth and smoke from small cooking fires. Songs rose slowly, unhurried, their words simple. Gratitude for water, for bread, for life. Children fell asleep to the sound of crickets, frogs, and the soft lap of water against the bank. For them, the Nile was not a wonder. It was simply there, as constant, as breathing, as ordinary as waking, and as necessary as dreaming. In its stillness, the Nile taught patience. It reminded people that power did not have to shout. Its rhythm was slow but unyielding, and from that rhythm grew pyramids, cities, stories, and gods. All of Egyptian civilization was, in truth, a long conversation with the river, conversation carried on in planting and harvesting, in hymns and feasts, in stone and papyrus, in birth and in burial. Even now, when you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the gentle slap of water against a wooden hull, the distant cry of a bird across the reeds, the murmur of families speaking in low voices as they wait for stars to climb the sky. The Nile flows still, not in haste, but in memory. The Nile did not simply arrive, it kept an appointment. Long before clocks and instruments scattered the day into fragments, Egypt learned to count by the quiet arithmetic of water. The rivers rise and retreat, it spread across fields, and its patient return to its channel taught a rhythm that people made into a calendar, 3 seasons braided from one current. In the soft grammar Egyptians loved, the year opened with Akhet, the inundation, then Pert, the season of emergence and growth, and finally Shamu, the season of harvest and heat. The words themselves moved like water, Akhet swelling, Pert unfolding, Shamu settling and shining under the long sun. At the edge of the river, where stone could keep a promise, men built millimeter stairways that entered the Nile like polite guests. Each step bore numbers in chisel strokes, each number carried hope and caution. At dawn a priest or scribe descended into the cool shade, the smell of wet stone traveling up to meet him. He gauged the mark where a river kissed stair, then climbed, and read it aloud. The town listened. A high reading meant generosity. Fields glossed with black silt, channels that would carry ease long into Pert. Too high meant were levees to tend. A village to shore up before the river's good intentions forgot their manners. Too low meant prayer and the careful dividing of what the year might still be persuaded to give. No one cheered, no one complained. They recorded, nodded, and went to the work appropriate to that number. Accuracy was comfort. Between flood and sowing, engineers with bare feet peopled the banks. They were not called engineers then, they were neighbors who knew what angles water likes. They lifted mud with baskets, mended levees with hands and reeds, lined small canals with something like stubbornness, a shadfaslin timber, a rope, a clay jar. And a counterweight stepped down to the river like a long-armed bird, and lifted water in an easy arc. The rhythm was unhurried. Pull, dip, swing, pour. Children learned the cadence by mimicking it in play. Men and women made the motion honest, hour after hour, swinging small rivers into fields where seeds slept. In some places, a water wheel nuzzled the current and turned, lifting pots full of water up and over in a gentle rain that could be heard even when eyes were closed. On mornings when the river was all mirror, and the sky had not yet written its brightness across it, boatmen untied lines that had remembered their knots all night, and let barges drift north with the obedient current. Coming home, they raised a square of sail to catch the south wind, the old friendship by which Egypt traveled without hurry, wind carrying men one way, water carrying them the other. A pilot stood at the prow with an oar, reading the language of ripples as if each eddy were a letter from the river addressed only to him. He recognized the feathered quiver that meant shallow, the slaty smoothness that meant depth, the nervous dance that meant a hidden snag. He called a soft word. Crew leaned. The boat threaded its path with the same courtesy geese used to pass through reeds. Along the banks, basins waited, fields bounded by low embankments, ranged in a mosaic that could drink the Nile and then return what it did not need. When the flood swelled, sluices were opened and closed with the patience of chess moves. Water filled one square, then another, then was guided further inland where thirsty furrows listened. Weeks later, gates were cut in the earthen walls, and the basins gave water back to the river or to their neighbors' fields, a slow commerce more generous than any market. A boy watching such a morning learned more geometry than any tablet could teach. The angle of a channel, the height of a gate, the speed of a trickle. The way a very small rise in earth can persuade a very large body of water to change its mind. The calendar itself was a patient tool, kinder than metal. Dawn after dawn, people lifted their eyes to catch the first appearance of a blue-white star rising before the sun, the star that promised the flood was near. New Year was named by a sparkle in a pale sky and a river remembering its promise. Farmers cut notches on doorposts to mark weeks of waiting. Priests marked the calendar boards. Housewives counted by tasks how many times linen had been washed and laid on reeds to whiten in the glare, how many jars of dried figs were sealed before sowing would begin. Children measured time by the growth of a calf, the length of a reed. Flute they were promised when harvest ended, the steady transformation of puddles into cracked mosaics where frogs hid, across Akut and into pert, quiet machines of the body back. And he who kept time with water. In the bright of noon, men with mattocks opened earthen gates to let a little more flow over a corner of field where the soil still frowned. In the blue of evening, women guided water into garden plots bounded by stones collected from the rivers. Winter moods. At night, a reed mat placed across a channel could slow it, urging the trickle to soak rather than to rush, teaching scarcity to become sufficiency. The quick intelligence of water met the slow intelligence of people, and between them they remembered how to feed a country. When the water retreated, the black earth came to receive seed with a sigh. Emmer and barley, lentils and flax, each found their depth and their companionship. Men scattered seed in a smooth swing across lines scratched with a forked stick. Boys and girls followed with light rakes, tucking sleep over the bright the way. A mother lays a blanket over a child. A man walked ahead with a basket behind him. A goat was led so her hooves would press seed into contact with silt, the smallest collaboration. Scare cords with shells kept birds honest. A boy's shout loosened the shyness of a heron so it lifted and went somewhere else to be beautiful. Wine came, green answered. The Nile carried stone with patience, and patience made monuments possible. From quarries at a bend where granite remembered fire, barges brought blocks whose weight could make a bank reconsider itself. On shore, overseers measured with cord and plumb. On water, pilots waited for a slightly higher level, a slightly kinder wind. No one hurried blocks. Stone prefers to be persuaded. In the delta, soft limestone from farther north arrived as if it had intended gentleness all along. On a quiet river afternoon, you could see both heredities dark and light sliding side by side like thoughts in an orderly mind. Markets learned from the river how to arrange themselves. Jars sealed with gypsum traveled to towns that had waited for oil. Papyrus sheets, pressed and rolled, went downstream to the hands that would teach them speech. Beer and squat amphorae rocked in the sun and did not complain. Baskets of onions and garlic lifted like small moons. Flax fiber, combed and glistening, lay in bundles that promised clothing and sails. Fishermen in their narrow boats threaded among the barges and called greetings that were half prayer, half joke. Oars lifted and fell, reeds listened, herons pretended not to be curious. Taxes, too, were watered by the river. The Nilometers reading informed scribes who wrote numbers on a straka and papyrus beside names and fields. The writing hand was light, the tone factual. If the river had been generous, the state would be too. If the river had been shy, then the people must be careful and the granaries must earn the trust invested in them. The granary was a kind of second river. Its door a sluice that opened and closed in response to the season's arithmetic. Children knew its smell, the cool dust, the faint sweetness, the sense of stored afternoons in every kernel. Bread begins in quiet places. The gods traveled by water as decorously as farmers and stone. On feast days, sacred barks swayed on the shoulders of priests and then rested on painted boats that slipped from temple quays into the current. Songs rose from decks and banks. Incense persuaded the air to remember cedar and myrrh. People watched not for spectacle but for reassurance. This year too the God is present, the river is faithful. Our work has not been in vain. When the boats returned to their stone shelters, the water's surface calmed, as if finishing a sentence. Life went on, blessed in ways that needed no translation. Preachers taught lessons without meaning too. Tilapia and catfish moved in the green-brown light, schooling along reeds that hid tiny frogs. Crocodiles whose bodies carried stories older than any poem lay like weathered logs on far banks. People watched respectfully and chose other paths. A hippopotamus sometimes lifted its eyes above the waterline at dusk, and then the river was given all the room it wanted. Ibises stepped with dignity that made the mud seem like polished stone. Egrets invented new whites every morning. When lotus opened, the day remembered how to smile. At night, the math of water became the math of stars reflected. A father folded a child into the crook of his arm and pointed at a bend in the river. Sky supped at rising. The old Sinan told the story again of how the flood returns because the relationship between the heavens and the earth is not a rumor, it is a vow. A mother took a broom to sweep the low threshold and listened to the small noises inside a pot settling, a reed mat sighing, someone's easy breath, and then to the small noises outside the water's conversation with reeds, a night bird adjusting its expectations, oars somewhere dipping. She smiled and put the broom away as if closing a book. What the Nile taught day after day was that measure is a mercy. A river that could have been Wallace agreed instead to be a calendar and a road, a pantry and a teacher. A people that could have been impatient agreed instead to count by floods and shadows, to build with numbers carved into steps, to give names to seasons only after those seasons had kept their promises for a long, long time. And because river and people made these courtesies to each other, the country learned the habit of enough. Sleep comes easily to a house that has heard the day carefully counted. The door is barred with a beam that fits its sockets cleanly. The jar is covered, the lamp is shaded, the air is cool. The river continues to do mathematics no one needs to correct. In the morning, another reading will be taken on the Nilometer. Another channel opened, another seed pressed to the block. None of this is dramatic. All of it is civilization. If the Nile was Egypt's breath, its boats were the words the breath carried. Every day they wrote sentences on the water, short ones between neighboring banks, long ones from south to north and back again. Some sentences were practical, grave to granary, stone to quay. Some were ceremonial, God to temple, blessing to people. Some were simply affectionate, family to market, fishermen to their favored bend. All moved with a dignity that came from doing the same thing very well for longer than anyone could remember. On a still morning, reeds along the bank made a soft fence against the sky. Papyrus stood taller, triangular stems rising in green spires topped with delicate sprays. Children broke the discarded shafts, and learned to knot them into small rafts that drifted in the shallows. Each boat a secret told to the current nearby. A man cut papyrus with a blade whose edge was sharper than his voice, bundled the stalks, and ferried them to a courtyard where water troughs waited. There, strips were laid in crisscross layers, pressed with stones, and left to become papyrus. Sheets of page born from river and light, thin as patience, strong as memory. A scribe later would hold such a sheet and feel the grain lie into directions. A quiet map of the date was made. Boats, both small and great, assembled at the quays. Fishermen's skiffs waited with their nets coiled like sleeping serpents. Broad-bellied cargo barges sat lower in the water, their planks swallowing and releasing the sound of the river's small hands patting them from below. A crewman checked sheets and stays, smoothing rope of twisted flax with a palm that could tell one strand's mood from another's. Pitch warmed under the sun, sweet and black. Cockers pressed it into seams with a tool smooth from use. The smell was part of boat language, as necessary as commands and jokes. A pilot took his oar and without ceremony pushed gently from the quay. The boat sighed forward. The current under the keel spoke in sociology. Under it, Egypt's villages of silt and root. Above it, Egypt's villages of roof and reed. Against the aft rail, a jar of beer cooling in a net lowered into the river bobbed in rhythm with the crew's hearts. The captain tested the south wind, lifted the square sail, and felt the boat's small shiver of happiness. The river accepted the new plan without argument. Along the left bank, brickmakers worked at the edge of damp places. Mud from the river mixed with straw trodden by feet that knew how to press persuasion into clay became bricks lined in rows under the sun. A child turned one carefully because she had been told to let the wind see all four sides. Not far away, granaries with rounded corners and cool, high walls stored afternoons, mornings, and the entire patience of the previous year in germ form. Geese complained about being useful. Dogs negotiated their friendships. Farther upriver, a caravan of stone moved in the slow grammar of necessity. Granite blocks, younger than gods and older than songs, lay centered and confident on rafts built like broad assertions. The crew steered not quickly but rightly. On the bank, men with poles walked and hummed a tune that matched the boat's speed. They would loosen lines or take strain with the understanding of those who have learned that time's strongest ally is attention. At a bend, a man on the prow pointed, and the pilot adjusted the angle by a finger width. The difference between argument and agreement. Fishermen lowered nets that fell like dusk and lifted them like morning. The catch flashed briefly silver like coins and green like reeds, then settled into quiet in the baskets. A boy learned to gaff a fish without bruising its dignity. He could name the shoals by the way ripples braided near a certain point of reed and rock. His father, pretending not to be proud, pretended to find fault with knots and then remembered to smile. On the bank, a woman salted fish with small movements that promised supper would be easy. The smoke of low fires held steady in the thin wind and told the river that the shore was ready to meet it halfway. Birds wrote brighter sentences on the air. Ibis stepped with their curved pens, signing the mud. Herons unfolded themselves into decorations that lifted entirely without noise. Kingfishers insisted on blue that should not be possible, even in Egypt, and then proved it was. Lotus and blue water lily opened to the day as if the day needed encouragement. Bees moved from water to garden and back, stitching the shoreline to the fields with their invisible thread. If you drifted past a temple on a feast day, you could see boats with painted eyes, their prows curving like the eyebrows of gods. Priests carried a shrine of bark within the boat whose canopy shone with gold leaf that took sunlight and gave it back more carefully. On the bank, people lowered their heads without anxiety, the way one nods to a friend. The songs that rose were low and measured, designed for the river to carry intact to farther ears. When the procession passed, the water returned to being purely river, which is a kind of holiness too. Households used the Nile as if it were a corridor that belonged to everyone and no one. Families crossed by ferry, the oar pulling a line that hummed like a string drawn across a quiet instrument. A donkey stamped on the plank and was persuaded by a man whose voice was half apology, half promise. A girl carried a jar on her head with such balance that the boat seemed to take instruction from her spine. On the far bank a field changed color by an imperceptible degree, growth so precise you could fail to see it, harvest so assured you could fall asleep and trust it. In the delta, the river began to forget its singularity. It became many mouths, many silences, many lanes, each with particular birds and particular breezes. Boats there were lower and more comfortable, with reeds very near to their elbows. Fishermen set up racks where fish spread, and salted turned into a winter that would not complain. Children learned rivers plural, and in later years, when they traveled south, they were pleased to discover again that a river can be one thing as well as many. Nights on boats were loose nets of time. A watchman leaned on a mast and found constellations mirrored in water where no one had put them. The crew spoke softly about nothing and everything, a new child, a good harvest, a small debt, a larger kindness. The way a pilot at another bend had once saved a cargo through a gesture so precise, it was like a sign taught by a god. Sleep came in turns, and the Nile moved everyone equally. A jar made a polite cluck against a plank, oars rested. The boat dreamed itself more gracefully upstream than was strictly necessary. Storms arrived as firm opinions, seldom as rages. When the sky lowered, sails came down and conversations lengthened under them, as if the cloth had become a tent for stories. Rain erased dust on deck and then left. The river rose a little or not at all. In its headwaters far away, something might have changed color here. A fisherman noticed only that the air smelled new and that his daughter would need a longer stick to reach the last figs if this wind kept up. The boat adjusted itself as well as any creature could adjust to weather, and in the morning the world apologized by making the light over the water behave like silk. On days when work was thin and the current slow, boatmen carved little things: the handle for a knife, a bead for a child, the towboat for a boy who had been brave at a crossing, using wood that had once dreamed of being mast and had instead become kindness. A man mended a net with the contentment of a person allowed to heal something. A woman on the bank, seeing the net's patient triangles, thought of tapestry and of the way patterns repeat to invite the mind inward and then back out into the world. Even idleness, here, was a form of belonging. Land and water talked every hour. At the watering places, cattle stepped down in a line so familiar that their hooves had trained the slope. The led cow liked the particular stone. Children predicted her choice and were proud when they were right. At laundry stones, women beat linen, slap, rinse, twist, laughing in the places laughter belonged, and keeping silence in the places silence earned reverence. At boat landings, rope learned grooves in posts, and posts learned to accept rope without splinters. A set of grooves told the story of a village better than any inscription. As harvest approached, boats changed their smell. The scent of grain took over, sweet, dusty, persuasive. The water bounced in like that made geese seem newly invented. Men loaded baskets in a rhythm no drum could fall. Women counted by piles and shadows. Boys who had learned to swim in the spring now learned to stack in the fall. The granaries filled. A scribe came down with his brush, wrote a few numbers that would outlast his sandals, and then folded the papyrus over the bundle as if tucking a child. The Nile accepted praise and complaint with the same expression. On a year when water was low, boats crept closer to the center and men carried pole and oar with the humility of those who talk to a friend they may have offended. On a year when water was high, boats hugged banks so they could be seen, and moorings were double knotted because a good thing insists on respect too. In both cases, the river listened and said, in water's ancient language, I am doing what rivers do. Help me help you, they did. What did the boat say? If you learn to hear them, that movement can be restful when it agrees with the world's own habits. That distance is best eaten slowly, with breath. That work completes itself when it includes pauses that let the eye find reeds and birds and the way light draws long lines across wavelets. That relationships between shores, between seasons, between people who must share a deck are boats that stay afloat if everyone chooses to. Balance. Tonight, barges will tie up to bollards that know their names. Nets will dry with a sound like parchment turning. Reeds will lean and whisper to themselves. A pilot will pull his cloak a little higher. Not because he is cold, but because the night enjoys being tucked in. The Nile will tell stars a story they have asked for since they were recent. And in the morning, the first oar will push away with the gentleness only a long friendship can sustain. Asterisk. Morning in an Egyptian village does not begin with haste. It opens like a door pushed by a breeze, quiet, inevitable, kind. Light finds the river first, then palms. Then the smooth shoulders of mud brick houses that have taken the shape of generations. Roofs are flat and sensible, walls thick and whitewashed. Remember how to keep heat polite. In the cool before the sun gathers its arguments, someone lifts a wooden latch, and a courtyard receives the day. Courtyards are rooms without ceilings, pages where the household writes its life. A clay oven, a domed beehive of warmth waits. With yesterday's embers banked under ash, a quernstone sits close by. The upper stone wears the memory of 1,000 circles in the smoothness of its palm-wide track. Baskets hang from pegs like quiet moons. Water jars stall, narrow-shouldered, cool to the touch, condense a skin of dew that beads and slides down to darken the clay. A cat steps over a broom and decides to remain. The first sound is grain poured into a hand. Emmer and barley whisper. Into a shallow basket, a woman kneels to the quern and begins the work that turns fields into bread. The motion is steady and merciful to wrists. Press, draw, return, press, draw, return. A girl feeds grain at one side and gathers meal at the other, fingers learning that flour feels like a promise even before it is dough. In a corner, flax fibers pale, silky, clean as a river thought hang in small hanks. An older woman teases them to thread, spindle whirling, twist passing into fiber like breath into reed. The courtyard hums with the soft instruments of breakfast. The oven wakes, dough salted and kneaded with a rhythm that smooths both bread and mind, becomes rounds, then discs. A peel slides, a door lifts. A child watches for the sighing grown-ups trust. The first sweet smoke, the first blistered brown bread is born into air that learns quickly to love it. Somewhere nearby, a pot of lentils and onions has already learned to simmer. Oil catches light in a shallow bowl. Garlic crushed with a stone that knows its duty leans its scent over everything. Men pass the doorway, their voices low. Some will go to fields to lift water in arks with a shed. Some to tend cattle, some to repair a levee edge where the river tested a corner. Others potter, basket maker, carpenter of small tools will arrange their workshops in shade and let the day come to them. A boy carries a coil of rope and a handful of pegs, proud because he has errands. A newborn goat finds the courage to be noisy. A rooster decides against evidence that he has news. Houses hold both shade and order. Inside, the floor is swept. Mats of reed and palm fiber teach feet to be quiet. Knit shelves keep lamps, amulets, and a clay figure that makes courage domesticated. The dwarf god with the lion's smile who frowns at trouble and is kind to mothers. Next to him, a hippopotamus lady with a crocodile tail, patient, protective, watches over children who pretend not to look at her when they pass. The household's small shrine does not demand a parade. It prefers a glance and a thank you. On a peg, a necklace of faience beads, the blue of water's better days, waits for a throat. Clothes are light and sensible, linen woven thin for the long heat falls straight. A man knots his kilt and lifts a basket to his shoulder. A woman smooths the sheath dress that fits like a promise to keep cool. A child in a short tunic rushes past with the dignity of someone with a job. To keep the chickens honest and the water jug unspilled. Hares braided, oiled, covered with a scarf in midday. Bare at dawn and dusk when the air is brave enough to be kind. Work spreads like shade slow wide. Inevitable. In one courtyard, a potter sets coils along a turntable spun by a foot, coaxing walls upward with fingers that know how to persuade clay to remember water without becoming water. Rims are smooth with a wet slip, handles appear where hands will later be glad they exist. In another, baskets grow from the middle out, date palm fibers, and rushes learning to be circles, ovals, oars for carrying grain and figs and the day's decisions. A carpenter reshapes a broken hoe handle, grain of the wood running the same direction as his patience. A girl watches and learns how a tool lies in a hand when it is ready to work. The village lane is a long conversation. Donkeys pass, sure-footed, their sides decorated with dust that looks like script and is just as telling. Dogs examine corners for new stories and settle for the old ones. A woman walks with a jar balanced on her head. Her gait teaches the lane how to be graceful. A man with a reed mat under his arm stops to talk politics of the useful kind. The canal gate at the far field, the timing of the next basin opening. The rumor of grain prices from a market downriver. A child, hearing adults say numbers, holds onto them without knowing why. Market is both place and habit. On market day, shade is made where there was none by poles and cloth, fish salted and sun-stiff smell of river, and resolve. Onions pile in brave towers, and do not fall. Figs soften under their own sugar. A woman pinches a linen bowl to test honesty, not distrust. A scribe sits with a straka and brush. Numbers bloom briefly, and then stand still. A clay toy hippopotamus, with a grin, finds a home because a small boy has earned a coin by remembering to shut a gate. The noise is gentle. Bargaining is a game that ends in friendship. Children work and play in the same hour, which is how the day stays kind to their feet. They run with hoops on the packed earth, shouted geese, and pretend geese obey, float leaf boats in irrigation channels. Learn to flick a small fish from shallow water into a bowl with a speed that impresses both fish and family. Games are old: throwing sticks, juggling balls, an afternoon version of prophecy done with pebbles and luck. At dusk, they build a small pretend oven and bake a child's bread that is mostly air and victory. Midday is negotiated, not endured. Roofs receive sleepers who lie under woven shade and learn to be lighter than heat. Women finish grinding and wash cornstones so flour does not harden into the wrong kind of memory. A jar of beer is poured, a small beer, gentle, rinsing the dust from inside as well as the throat. Dates are split and removed of date stones that will be later strung into useful weights for nets in a back garden. Gourds and cucumbers soldier on undermatting that persuades the sun to be patient. The Nile breathes through the village in a breeze that tastes of green. Afternoons return people to what they were already doing, but softer. Linen is beaten clean at the river stone slab. Rinse, twist, then spread on reeds to discover how bright it can become. Flax fibers reappear as thread. Thread becomes warp. Warp waits for weft. A simple loom uprights and dulls pegs, and patience makes a house of string. The shuttle passes, the beater convinces, cloth grows like a polite vine. An older woman adjusts a beginner's hand and says nothing. The girl nods as if she heard words. The village's animals know their lines. Cattle are led to water in late day when the air has learned manners. Their hooves punctuate mud with a script the river knows how to read. Goats test boundaries and then decide to be sociable. A goose volunteers to interpret events loudly. A cat, having done unspecified but useful work in the granary, stretches and becomes ornamental. Donkeys practice patience. Their owners practice gratitude disguised as complaint. Evening smells are a recipe. Wood smoke, onion, fish, crushed mint, the faint mineral cool of wet clay. Lamps wake in niches, a turn of the wick, a breath to encourage flame. A bloom of light that makes walls look freshly painted. Dinner is a plate of bread that broke cleanly, a bowl of stew that remembers the garden, a pinch of salt that remembers the dessert, a relish of chopped greens and oil that remembers the olive press. Conversation is inventory, and prayer mixed so thoroughly that they cannot be strained apart. Harvest, health, the neighbor's baby, the stubborn gate. The praise of a river that kept its promise another day. Stories return like relatives who never overstay. A grandfather speaks of the year when water took longer to climb the stair and how the village answered without anger. Smaller loaves, shared jars. A granary that opened at dusk with nobody counted but everybody remembered. A grandmother tells the children how bees frightens away nightmares by making faces at them. The children practice. Someone repeats the tale of the ibis who taught doctors how to be tidy. The oldest story is not the most exciting. It is the most useful. That patience is a tool that does not wear out. When heat lingers, families climb to roofs. The sky is broader there. Breezes remember their obligations. Mats are spread. Pillows found. The cat, who has no respect for plans, makes room that was not meant for him, and is not evicted. From roof to roof, the village murmurs. A flutist, practicing generosity, sends a slow tune that drifts over the date palms. Far off, a boat clucks against a mooring. Closer, a baby sighs, and proves the day has learned to be kind. Night gives rooms back to shadows. A lamp goes out because oil has its own calendar. A mother touches a child's hair. A father checks a latch. An elder folds a cloth and tucks it under a jar to persuade ants to mind their business. The little shrine receives its last glance. Somewhere a neighbor coughs, and then is quiet. The river's sound edits the day, removes urgency, leaves meaning. Sleep arrives without arguments. In the dark, houses practice memory. The quern, cleaned and leaned against the wall, dreams of grain that has not yet been harvested. The oven cools and remembers warmth exactly. It will not be confused in the morning. The loom holds its place, warp taut in the night like an instrument that will not go out of tune. Tools rest in a corner that is a kind of chapel. Handles shine where hands have believed in them. Tomorrow is already present in the neatness of these things. What, in truth, is village life along the Nile? It is not spectacle. It is continuance, the art of beginning again without fuss. It is proportion, chores sized to bodies, tasks stacked one on another so that no or must shout. It is company, neighbors within calling distance, gods within nodding distance. The river always within earshot. It is bread done properly and linen that dries white and water that lifts and lowers exactly enough to keep both fields and tempers reasonable. If you listen closely, you can hear the village answering the day's last question. Did we keep faith with one another? With small yeses. A door left ajar for a lake traveler. A bowl sent next door because someone's pot cracked. A mat moved to make room for a cousin. A story told without the part that would make someone ashamed. These are the walls of the house as surely as mud brick. Courtesies thick against weather. Sleep now. The courtyard is a softer dark. The oven a warmer shadow. The cat, at last, a compromise. Between fur and night, beyond the lane, the river never hurried, never bored, moves like a long breath through reeds. It has seen the village finish its day with grace, and is satisfied. In the morning, flour will whisper again, water will rise in an arc, bread will be persuasive, thread will remember to be thread. This is enough, this is everything. A village on the Nile wears the year like a light cloak, three folds, always the same, always a little different. It swells the banks and lends the fields a mirror. Kurt teaches green to speak. Shamu lays grain in baskets and makes the jars. Proud, inside that slow, generous grammar, 100 small sentences are spoken every day, a rope spliced, A wall whitewashed, the child shown how to carry a jar without scalding the water. Nothing here is hurried unless the river asked it to be, and even then the answer is steadiness rather than speed. When the inundation retreats, the village becomes a studio with many rooms. At the water's edge, levees are mended by hands that learned mud's moods from their mothers. Men and women stand ankle-deep, firming an edge, smoothing a slope, pinching a spillway close the way you pinch dough. A shad lifts and sighs. Lifts and sighs, its counterweight swinging like a slow pendulum. Children fetch pegs, drive them in with stones, and feel taller than their sandals. A boy learns where to place his foot so the bank does not soak. A girl learns how to press a palm along the little wall and find where it needs another handful of earth. The day is patient with their learning. Behind the houses, courtyards turn into workshops. In one, a woman sits with a beer mash steaming quietly in a clay vat, barley malted on mats, crushed with kindness, mixed with warm water and a little of yesterday's yeast. The village is small. Useful memory. She strains the brew through a wicker sieve lined with rush. The liquid runs like healthy soil in a flood channel. Loaves baked especially for the brew crumble into the sweet. Dates lend a polite nod of sugar. The jar's mouth is sealed with a disk of clay and a promise not to rush it. Across the lane, another courtyard smells like olives arguing gently with stone. Men turn a wooden beam slow as prayer, and a press answers with a gleam. The oil catches sun in a shallow bowl and returns it with better manners. Where the lane widens, the potter's wheel spins underfoot. A jar lifts out of earth as though it had been there waiting for its cue. The potter's thumb draws a groove where a woman's hand will later grip. A lip is smooth where a lid will consent to sit without rattling. He wipes a wet slip along the neck and blinks when light is persuaded to stay a heartbeat longer. On a shelf, cups remember river water. On another, storage jars stand like short, strong friends. The basket maker sits cross-legged nearby. Date palm fibers in a lap like a tidy pile of river grass. Spirals become ovals. Ovals become carriers. Carriers become the daisies. Reed mats grow in the shade. Lines as straight as a promise. Walls are kept honest to the weather. Through the seasons, whitewash returns to mud brick like fresh snow to an old mountain. A mixture of chalk, ash, and patience becomes brightness that throws heat away at midday and gives the night a kind look. You can tell which houses were washed last week by how the sun chooses them first. Roofs, flattest of neighbors, are rolled with stones to compact the plaster. Small cracks are taught to be small. A ladder leans, a brush is dipped. A woman hums the tune the brush requires to keep its fibers agreeing. A child, allowed one stroke, thinks he has painted the kingdom. Animals practice their professions. Donkeys carry baskets with an air of having written the textbook. A little bell keeps a tempo that lanes enjoy. Oxen, who will pull a plow tomorrow, chew cut today under shade that a fig tree invented long ago. Goats audit fences and file gentle complaints by leaning where leaning is forbidden. They are answered with extra steaks and a joke. Cats move between granary and kitchen with the quiet authority of a scribe. Mice read the new law quickly. Dogs lie across thresholds and wag the rumor away from doors. Chickens embroider dust with their feet and decide where sun is best out in purr. The fields are notebooks. A harrow combs lines into the memory's flood left. Seed drops in a swing. The arm could describe a sleep. A rake lets soil close its eyes over the future. Along the irrigation ditches, women snap mint and mallow, gather leeks and onions, pinch coriander and dill for supper broths that sound humble and taste like gratitude. Flax combed from last year's stems lies ready in hanks that shine like river hair. Thread twists on spindles that spin without complaint. Loons stand in doorways like tall, thin doors into the future. A girl learns the small trick of the shuttle. How to send it with enough persuasion to cross and enough trust to be caught. There is a day each fortnight when roofs become tables for the sky. Linen is beaten, rinsed, wrung, then spread thin as dawn across reed racks. The sun makes its careful corrections. The wind writes its brief comments. The cloth accepts both and becomes white, not a boastful white, a useful one. On such days, the village smells like water, thinking out loud. Women dip combs with fine teeth through children's hair, oiling, tidying, telling stories of crocodiles that prefer manners to meat when faced with a brave mother. Small coal pots sit on a shelf, a fingertip darkens lids against glare and envy. A copper mirror, polished until it remembers the idea of seeing, lets a woman check the straightness of a braid. Meals learn the season's handwriting. In cooler hours, lentils and emmer become soups that agree with the body. Fish salted near the bank dry on racks over, flattening to pewter, then to supper. Dates are split and strung, figs sun themselves on woven trays. Jars take on lids of clay sealed with a thumbprint and a little twine. In the corner of a cool room, grain sleeps in baskets lined with chaff to make mice earn their crimes. They seldom do, because the cat is littered. A grandmother shows a child how to set a shallow dish of water, and her table leg is a moat for ants. The ants accept geography. The scribe visits like a traveling weather. He sits under eave with a basket of astraka shards that used to be pots and are now small, faithful papers. People come in ones and twos. A man asked for a receipt for a measure of barley. A woman asked for a list of names to send with a jar of oil as a gift to a sister's household. The scribe's brush moves in dark lines, the curves and birds of the script perching on clay with the calm of things that intend to last. He is paid in coins sometimes, more often in trust bread and news. He writes the millimeters last readings in a corner of his memory and compares them with what the village is feeling underfoot. He is pleased, this year, with how the numbers and the field seem to agree. Disputes happen and are folded small. Everyone knows the bench where elders sit at a sensible hour, shade soft. Tempers compatible, a sluice open to long, a path narrowed by a wall's curiosity. A goat that admired a neighbor's onions to practically. Words are measured like grain, the scoop is leveled with a straight edge. A decision is given that lets tomorrow's lane still be walked together. If apology is owed, it arrives with a bowl. If repair is needed, a cousin appears with a tool. The river has taught the village that continuance is more valuable than victory. Children receive lessons that look like games. A boy learns to judge a jar's fullness by the sound it makes when tapped. He is correct 2 times out of 3 and is praised for the 2, teased gently for the 3rd. A girl calculates how many reeds make a mat that fits the coal corner by the door. Her mother nods at the number and then shows a trick with the edge that makes it lie flatter. They learn measures by touch, a hand's breadth for this, a forearm for that, a pace for the distance to the river that counts as near. They also learn silence, the good kind, on the roof at dusk. When geese fly and their V writes a sentence the village has read for as long as anyone can. Remember, festival arrives not to interrupt but to join the week. There is a day when musicians walk the lane, sistrum shimmering like a small river of bronze, tambourines teeping the village's heartbeat in public, clappers sounding like laughter in wood. Women move as if their ankles were politely greeting each other. Men step lightly to show their sandals how to be proud without boasting. A painted bark, small, tender cousin of the temple's grander boat circles the village. A priest speaks blessed names. Incense persuades even the stubborn corners to smell like cedar and mercy. Children run along the edges and pretend to be important. No one prevents them. At the edge of the date grove, the brick field becomes a school of earth. Mud is mixed with chaff, molds are filled and tipped, rows grow long as a parable. The sun does his part. Later, a wall is lifted into the day, course by course. With a rhythm that makes even the geese consider quiet, a man pats a joint and leaves the imprint of a palm. A child reaches up and adds a smaller emblem lower down. When the house dries, the marks remain. family signatures written in clay inside. Niches are shaped for lamps and amulets. The little gods of thresholds, one grinning, one serious, move in without ceremony and begin their watch. There is a midwife in every village, and she is known by the way strangers nod. Her basket is neat, linen, oil, a cord that remembers strong knots, a charm that is less magic than morale. She visits when doors are half open, sits until the room learns to breathe, says things that make husbands useful and quiet. A kettle hums, a lamp is trimmed, the child arrives and looks offended for one moment, then decides this particular air will do. Neighbors remember to bring broth, and not opinions. The midwife goes home with the slow walk of someone who has made the day better and does not need witnesses. In Shamu, the village becomes the sound of grain speaking in many dialects, rustle in the field, clatter into baskets, hush in the granary, sigh into flour. Men set snaiths to stalks. Women buying sheaves with wrists that have taught reeds how to behave. Children glean and are shown where abundance hides even after work believes itself finished. Carts tilt under generosity that demands good wheels. A millstone sings in a tone that means supper will not be late. The smell of new bread is not an event, it is a confirmation. Illness visits, but the village keeps a cupboard of ordinary mercies. A woman steeps peppermint for a stomach that is not behaving. A man warms a cloth with oil for a knee that remembered yesterday too vividly. A child's scrape receives honey and a bandage and a story that makes bravery look like an old family tragedy. The oldest remedy is company. Someone sits by the door with a basket and a joke. Someone minding the baby so the mother can sleep. Someone counting the night in small prayers so a fevered neighbor does not feel alone with fire. When the temple physician is needed, he is fetched with courtesy. When he is not, the village remembers that clean water and clean sheets are a sacrament. There is news even when no messenger arrives. The river writes it, a smell in the breeze that tells of far rains, a color that says Ethiopia has been generous. A level on the stone stairs that argues for planting one field deeper and another shower. The birds write it, ibis in numbers that predict frogs, in numbers that predict mosquitoes, in numbers that predict prudent nets for sleeping. The dates write it, clusters heavier than last year mean more baskets must be mended. The figs write it, with their own ink, the sticky that finds a child's cheek and promises a scolding will be delayed until laughter is complete. At dusk, hospitality finds its easiest tone. A jug is set near a door for whoever passes thirsty. A stool appears from nowhere when an elder pauses. A bowl is sent across a lane under cloth so it arrives modest. The stories of the house drift to the roof. The cool lifts from the river and tries each window. Lamps choreograph the darkness. One here for weaving 2 more inches. One there for a child not yet done with a riddle. One by the shrine, small and handsome, that will remember to be last. The village becomes a constellation. The gods would approve of lights placed with meaning. Night gives the granary a voice like a sleeping animal. Its low, contented breath is the sound of a year convinced. The tools in the corner become a neat shadow-matic. Rake, the rake's missing tooth waiting to be replaced in the morning. The rope coiled on a peg looks like a well-behaved serpent. The water jar exudes a little cool sweat, satisfied with its day's service. On the roof, someone tells a child the names of 3 stars and invents a 4th for the pleasure of it. The child will ask tomorrow and learn the true name, and fold both into a private sky. What is the shape of happiness here? It is small weather inside a wall, bread that breaks, clean floors that stay swept, a cow that keeps her opinion but shares her milk, a jar that does not leak, a sluice that listens, a fence that consults with goats and wins. It is public fairness that behaves, measures in the market, decisions under the tree, the scribe's brush that does not exaggerate. It is useful beauty, a pot whose curve sits right in the hand, a map that lies without sulking, a headdress carved to hold the neck in a piece the body recognizes as honest. And when sleep arrives, and it always does, welcomed not trapped, it finds a village that has rounded its corners for the night, embers comfortable under ash, doors set with bars that fit their sockets with no argument, cats on patrol, dogs dreaming regulated dreams, children surrendered to the serious work of growth, elders content with the number of times the breeze discovered them on the roof. The now moves by with its own long thought. The stars attend. The gods, even the small ones with the large teeth and good humor, smile in their niches. Tomorrow will not surprise anyone. It will simply present itself with dignity and be met with the same. Healing keeps step. A midwife becomes a healer for bruises and fears when devils are rumored, and sleep is shy. Her remedies are modest. Honey on a cot, mint in a cup, oil warmed in a bowl and rubbed where the day has been unkind. A herbalist knows where plantain hides and what garlic says to fever. The temple physician is fetched when the body argues too loudly. He brings measures learned from papyrus and yours. He also brings a habit of washing hands and tools, and this is never wasted. When there is nothing more to be done, there remains sitting the cure for loneliness that the village prescribes without fee. Letters travel in small ways. A cousin, a preacher, receives a papyrus sheet with words careful as footprints in wet clay, harvest promise, health of elders, the baby's name, a request for a jar that doesn't leak, and a knife that isn't vain. Sometimes a letter to the dead is tucked in a crack of a tomb wall, asking for help with a stubborn lawsuit or a child who will not sleep. Potsherds collect such secrets and keep them better than boxes do. Literacy here is part reading, part remembering. Even those who cannot write can recite, and texts live safely in mouths. Festival returns like a tide. Musicians with sistermen, clappers, and a drum with a goat-skin face call the village to walk a lane that has been walked since the first crocodile decided to be polite. A small bark with painted eyes rides human shoulders. Incense makes the air briefly like cedar. The goddess who likes music is greeted with exactly as much clapping as she prefers. People ask for nothing impossible. Good water, healthy calves, easy births, mild floods, bread that doesn't argue, temper that stops early. The procession returns to the shrine, the lane returns to children and chickens, everyone returns to being people who can be pleased by ordinary success. Evenings are when the village adds ornament to survival. A woman inks coal at her eye, out of vanity alone, but because sunlight respects the dark line. A man oils his beard because dust should not win every argument. Children are polished with water so sleep will find them quicker. The cat claims the warmest place and is not debated. The dog lifts his head when a step he knows passes the door, and sleeps again when the step belongs to a friend. Neighbors on roofs exchange news without voices, just hands in air making the shapes of harvest, fish, goats, and, when necessary, crocodiles. When the south wind sleeps and the stars rise, stories climb onto rooftops. A grandfather points to Sopdet and tells again how its rising teaches the river to keep its appointment. A grandmother adjusts a pillow under a child's neck and recounts a dream so small it might be true. A field that sowed itself, a boat that drifted exactly to the right key, a jar that refilled because it liked the family. Dreams are treated kindly here. They are allowed to leave the house with the dawn if they wish, but no one slams the door behind them. What holds all this together is not a single rule but a texture, the feel of fairness in the hand, the sound of a promise that fits exactly, the smell of bread that agrees with the room, the sight of water arriving on time. A village survives by practiced courtesy, to river, to tool, to neighbor, to God, to the stubborn goat who will be forgiven tomorrow. It is not a system that brags. It is a conversation that has learned to stay calm. Tonight the lamps will shrink, the courtyards will cool, and the Nile will carry everyone's breathing like a barge that never leaks. Somewhere a roof will receive a wedding laugh that has not finished yet. Somewhere a house will hush itself round a newborn. Somewhere a tomb will receive bread and beer, and the exact names of those who remember. The doors of the heart will swing once more softly on hinges that are older than any wall, and the village will sleep with them slightly open, because welcome is how tomorrow finds its way back. Every village keeps a handful of doors that the day passes through again and again. The door of birth, the door of naming, the door of marriage, the door of farewell. They do not swing with drama. They move on well-oiled hinges of custom, along the Nile, where fields breathe in water and breathe out grain. These doors are opened quietly with hands that know how to be gentle and useful at the same time. Morning, still cool, pauses at a house whose lamp burned late. A midwife sits in the doorway, skirt dusted with clean sand, hands oiled, shoulders content. Inside, a baby answers the world with a small, decisive voice, then decides the world is acceptable, and sleeps. A shallow bowl of warm water, a clean cloth, a string to tie the tiny knot of new life. These are the instruments of the first ritual. Someone hangs a sprig of palm and lotus above the bed, not for spectacle but to invite good manners from fate. On a niche shelf, the little dwarf god with the lion grin and the pregnant hippopotamus lady keep their watch. No one asked them for miracles. People asked them only to keep trouble busy somewhere else. The naming is both ordinary and large. A grandmother leans close and whispers the chosen word as if teaching a secret to a flame. A father steps to the threshold and says the name again toward the lane so the village can receive it. He does not shout names, prefer to arrive like light, not thunder. A shallow cup of beer moves from hand to hand, a drop touched to the baby's lips. Bread is broken with the same care as on any other morning, but everyone notices the sound the crust makes, and how the room seems to agree with it. An amulet faience blue like water's best idea finds a small string and a small neck. The baby sleeps on, forgiven for not applauding. Days become the slow work of growing. The courtyard teaches the first lessons, how flour becomes meal, how meal becomes dough, how dough becomes bread, and how bread disappears politely after a blessing. A child learns to stand by grabbing a quern's edge, learns to walk by reading a basket of onions, learns to speak by renaming the family cat 5 times in an afternoon. Toys are stitched from scraps and whittled from palm ribs. A clay hippopotamus rolls clumsily with wheels and knows more jokes than it lets on. A reed flute makes 2 notes at first, then 3. A hand drum keeps the rhythm of a heart learning its patience. Work embraces children early, but not harshly. Small hands carry small water to a gourd bed, pick mint and mallow for a stew, shoe geese without convincing them. Help at the shed by holding pegs and feeling important. At the river stone, a child beats a rag with a smaller rhythm while a mother works beside with the larger one. On a roof, a girl learns to twist the spindle and not be discouraged when the first thread behaves like a young goat. In the lane, a boy walks a donkey without letting the donkey walk him. Instruction is equal parts proverb, demonstration, and laughter. Correction is quick and then forgotten. The market is school, theater, and chapel. A scribe sits under a shade roof with ostraca stacked like friendly leaves. Children watch how a number looks when it means grain, and how the same number looks when it means goats. A woman tests a bolt of linen with a pinch and a squint, and a daughter memorizes the recipe for honesty you can feel. A man buying salt says the measure aloud, and the seller repeats it so that fairness can hear itself. Musicians come by with sistrum and hand drum. A circle of feet learns the old step that keeps joy from slipping. Bargains end with a smile and a rumor of next week's price of onions. That rumor is a story that will be edited by noon and forgotten by evening. When a child becomes not small, the village hums a lower note and begins to weave kinship again. Marriage is a festival that knows how to be practical. Days before, women sit in a courtyard stringing dates and figs, grinding milker and henna, combing flax and laying aside fresh white linen that will listen kindly to heat. Men borrow stools, repair a missing peg on a drum, straighten a mouth that has ideas of its own. On the morning, palms are trimmed and set like brief green sentences along the lane. Friends carry jars on heads with a balance that makes the sun behave respectfully. The couple steps between neighbors, not as royalty but as to more threads crossing. The ceremony takes place in the language of food and promise. Bread is broken and shared with precision. Beer is poured and sipped carefully so no joke embarrasses the day. A shallow dish of salt is touched, a bit of oil shines on wrists. Two lamps are held together for a moment so that their flames can examine each other and agree. Gifts are not dramatic. A basket that fits the hand, a jar that does not leak, a knife that can cut fiber without sulking, a bolt of linen that remembers patience. Musicians persuade the sky to smile. Women mark their hands and feet with red that will fade just as work resumes. The color's job is to say yes for a day and then yield to the ordinary yes of chores done side by side. Night brings a procession to the roof because roofs are where a house tells the sky its news. Blankets are spread, cups are passed, the youngest fall asleep, and the oldest tell stories big enough to keep mosquitoes polite. A neighbor brings a bowl without being asked. Another brings a joke that is older than both families and still serviceable. Happiness here is not loud. It is steady, a kind voice at the right moment, a cool jar of water and a palm that has not asked but needed. There are days when the village crosses water with baskets of flowers and plates of bread for the ancestors. The West Bank holds tombs that are more like quiet houses than palaces of fear. Doors carved in stone receive visitors who do not knock. Family sits outside in the shade, eats, and leaves a portion with lotus and onion, and a small jar of beer. Someone reads aloud a letter written on a potsherd. We remember you, please remember us. The words are not elaborate. Memory does not need adjectives. Children are told the names and repeat them without knowing they are planting time in their mouths. When loss visits because it must, a village answers with order. The body is washed with water and a little oil, wrapped in linen that has learned tenderness from years of washing and wearing. For the poor, a reed mat or a simple wooden coffin for those who can spare it, a carved box with a lid that fits honestly. A small amulet is tucked in not to command fate, only to accompany the traveler. Bread and beer are set where they will be found, not because hunger persists after breath, but because kindness should. The funeral walks without hurry, wailing, rises and falls like a wind that cleans the corners. Words are said, simple and exact. Back in the village, a pot is set to simmer. A neighbor sits by the door so the bereaved can sleep. And the cat is fed because the cat does not understand death and should not have to. Between these great doors, most days are made of familiar thresholds. A woman stepping from shade to sun with a jar on her head says a small prayer without words that the path be even and the breeze agreeable. A man carrying a coil of rope to the field nods to the millimeter stare as if greeting a trustworthy clerk. A child raises both hands to be lifted onto a donkey and learns again that growing is mostly made of small permissions. At noon, shadow keeps time on a wall. At evening, lamps write darkness into friendliness. At night, roofs become plains where dreams herd themselves without supervision. Before a temple receives incense or a pyramid learns the angle of sunlight, there is only silence in a quarry. Dawn reaches a wall of rock and pauses. The face of the cliff is pale where yesterday's work spoke, darker where tomorrow is still. Asleep, men arrive without speeches. They carry baskets for chips, mallets that know the shape of their hands, wooden wedges, copper chisels that have met many mornings, and jars of water that will be sipped as if each swallow were a small ceremony. A foreman traces a line with red ochre, not a command but a conversation. Here, and then here, stone listens. The first sounds are soft. A chisel is offered to rock and accepts a shallow bite. A wooden wedge is tapped into a crack wetted overnight. The wood drinking, swelling, politely insisting that a seam remembered self. Copper brightens where it meets the sun. Dust rises with the mildness of flour. The rhythm of work is old, and kind to wrists. Strike, pause, brush. Look, a block begins. As an idea, men step back and see it inside the cliff the way a potter sees a jar inside a lump of clay. They work around it before they dare work at it, freeing the block's shoulders and feet so that at last the back can be persuaded to forget the rest of the hill. Nothing here is hurried. The quarry floor keeps an orderly garden of channels and half-made pieces. Sledge paths are rubbed smooth by months of quiet insistence. Boys gather chips into baskets and carry them where the foreman points. They learn the weight of stone the way a child learns the weight of bread dough, first with surprise, later with respect. Shadows move along ledges like patient overseers. The sun, which can be rude in fields, is polite on stone, arriving in plains, leaving in angles, teaching geometry without a tablet. When a block agrees to be itself, ropes arrive as if they had been waiting in the reeds for the conversation to turn. Thick twisted flax, oiled so it will not argue, is looped around the stone's waist. Men lean and sing under their breath. The block hesitates, then slides onto a wooden sledge that has been rubbed with fat and dust until the runners feel like thought. A foreman nods. Someone wets the path, a thin skin of water that teaches sand to behave like floor. The team leans again. The sledge glides with the modesty of a well-made plan. From quarry to river, the day is measured in lengths of rope and the shade of traveling palms. There is no noise that frightens birds. A boy walks ahead and clears stones with the seriousness of a priest. Men in pairs move like oxen at a plow, their feet write lines into sand that others will use as senses. At a rest, water is shared, figs split, dates pressed into a palm that forgot breakfast. The joke is told, not for laughter's sake, but to keep breath going. The block's edges are covered with mats to protect the corners from the road's opinions. Everything is corrected long before it becomes a mistake. At the river, a barge waits with the patience of a well-fed animal. Planks and rollers create a short wooden language between land and deck. The block is coaxed aboard with shouts that are quiet and ropes that remember yesterday. The hull lowers into water like a respectful bow. The crew sets a square sail, catches the south wind, and the river please takes the weight as if it were an old story it likes to tell. On the bank, a man raises his hand. On the deck, another answers with a hand the same size. The boat moves from quarry to quay the way a thought moves from idea to sentence. Temples begin in ground that has been asked its permission. The site is leveled not by force but by repetition. String plumb water in a shallow dish that shows when a surface has learned to be calm. Lines are set with cord dyed in red and black. A surveyor sights the cardinal points, patient with dawn and the star that returns when it should. The first trench is cut and filled, not with stone, but with time. Men standing, checking, adjusting, until the ground itself seems to nod. Only then does the first layer, large blocks, broad and convincing, find their places, each bedded on sand that has been taught to be still. Walls grow like seasons do, slowly, exactly. Each course is set back a little, each joint kissed with gypsum mortar that will harden without boasting. Faces are left a little proud. Fine dressing comes later, with sunlight correct for seeing truth plain. A mason's plumb bob swings and rests. His square rests and approves. His hammer taps the kind of tap that is more listening than striking. In the shade, men soften copper tools over a small charcoal fire and hammer edges back into honesty on an anvil that remembers other edges. Sharpening is as important as laying. A dull tool is an insult to work and to the stone that consented to be moved. Roof blocks arrive like slow clouds. Ramps straight where there is room, turning where there is not, are built from rubble and patience, faced with planks, dressed with river clay, watered so they refuse to crumble. Men with levers persuade tons to behave like handfuls. The rhythm is always the same: lift a little, chalk, breathe, lift again, chalk, breathe. An overseer's voice holds everyone in one sentence. When the block arrives at its height, it is slid on rollers across the waiting wall and lowered, level by level, until it rests and becomes ceiling. The space below changes in that instant. Sheet becomes room, room becomes thought. A pyramid is the same conversation made steeper. Its plan is a square that wants to be a mountain. The angle of discipline learned from stars and from the sun's climb remains true because cord and I do not permit it to stray. Courses step inward until they become the sky's own staircase. Inside, corridors chase stillness, chambers learn silence, shafts point to places where night keeps its brightest fires. Whether ramps curled or climbed, whether levers multiplied will by inches, or the very sand was taught to accept sledges with a little water, these are techniques, not miracles. The miracle is patience arranged over years until stone agrees to tell time. Work is a village in motion. The builder's camp smells of bread, onions, fish salted and roasted, beer that remembers barley and warm jars, rows of neat houses long, narrow. Lintels modest line orderly lanes. There are workshops for copper, for stone hammers, for wooden sledges, for rope. There are physicians who bar dust from wounds. There are scribes who count baskets of grain and jars of beer, and the number of days a man has worked so that wages are accurate and tempers calm. A shrine stands at a corner, small and sufficient, and a priest pauses with a bowl of cool water and a blessing that does not interrupt anyone's task. In a shaded shed, artists begin their second building, the one that will persuade walls to speak. On fresh plaster, a grid is snapped with red cord. Figures take their proportion from squares, shoulders honest, knees obedient, hands long enough to hold the world gently. A draftsman draws, a carver follows. A painter fills emptiness with minerals taught to become color, red from ochre, yellow from a stone that remembers sun, green from powdered malachite, blue from ground frit baked into pigment that loves light. The order of process: outline, carve, paint keeps errors from growing proud. A lotus opens beneath a god's hand and will stay open as long as wall and roof agree. Temples breathe by doors and courts. A pylon gate broad-shouldered, calm receives. Processions on feast days. Priests lifting a sacred bark whose canopy holds a darkness that feels like good sleep. Singers moving sistrums with a sound that is half bronze, half river. Incense climbing with a grammar all its own. On ordinary days, a porter swabs the floor. A boy fetches water for the basin where hands are washed before touching holy things. A scribe traces a list of offerings that is half grocery, half poem. Columns in the hypostyle hall turn sunlight into lakes. The roof turns shadow into cool water in the mind. When wind speaks to the flagstaffs, the temple listens and remains itself. At Giza and at other royal fields, the pyramid sides receive their casing like a thoughtful garment. Fine limestone, dressed to a sly gleam, is slid into place with the care one uses for a new child. Edges aligned, faces trued, joints thin enough to make a mason smile when he runs a finger across them. Across each course, a quiet team works with polishing stones and sand and time, teaching light to flow without snagging. Far below, causeways carry offerings, as if the earth had grown a polite tongue for speaking to stone. Mortuary temple, with its basins and tables, learns the alphabet of bread and beer, lotus and onion, meat and incense. The dead do not eat, the living remember too. Behind the grand, the workman's village keeps its own dignified order. In a later age at Deir al-Medina, you could hear the same things: a quarrel rolled small under an official's thumb, a lending of a jar, a list of days on which a man could not work because his child had a fever, an apology written on a straca to an absent friend, a prayer scratched to a household god asking for a good night. Women ground grain that paid. Everyone, men, traded shifts on the cliff. Someone fixed a door that stuck. These are the stones of civilization, too lighter, but load-bearing. Tools are repaired more often than replaced. Copper chisels return to the fire to be softened, then to the hammer to be shaped, then to the stone to be tested, then back. The way a sentence is revised until it says what it means, and nothing more. The right pounders black, dense roll underfoot like obedient planets, eating away the softer face of granite until a boss stands proud, ready to be persuaded from the belly of the rock. Wooden levers, rubbed with oil, cradle edges and teach. Gravity to let go in inches. Ropes wear and are spliced. Sledges groove and are planed. Rollers split and are ray-rounded. The camp's refuse tells a story in fragments. Copper curls, charcoal ghosts, broken pots that will become someone's paper dot at sunset. The sight becomes a prayer without words. Ladders lean and rest. Plumb bobs hang in still air and point eye. A truth no one argues. The last bucket of water darkens the ramp where tomorrow's rise will be kind. A man squints along a line he snapped at dawn and sees that it is still cracked. Someone sets a chisel carefully on a folded cloth. The foreman draws his finger along a joint and smiles, as if he were tasting bread. The barge at the quay knocks once against its bollard, and then forgives. Stone cools, and with cooling, it learns to be part of a wall. Night turns even monuments into neighbors. A guard with a staff walks the base of a pyramid, and thinks about his daughter's first word. A cat follows, bored with eternity and satisfied. With mice, in the temple's court, a basin reflects stars that do not mind being copied. The columns exhale heat gathered all day and keep the air tolerable for bats that have a schedule. The builder's village sets lamps in niches. A woman mends a shirt at the doorway. A boy tells his mother the one joke he knows, again with improvements. In the foreman's hut, a papyrus lies under a weight to dry numbers of men in jars, and blocks and days nothing profound, yet the very texture of entrance. What do these stones mean, after all the breath and sweat? That patience can be arranged into shapes that correct the sky, that precision is a kindness to the tool, to the hand, to the future, that weight is not an enemy if it is given a path and a team, that geometry is not a trick, it is a promise kept by chord, eye, star, and sun working together, that glory, when it lasts, is built out of ordinary mornings added patiently to other ordinary mornings until centuries can stand on them without wobbling. In the end, a visitor will step into a temple's shade and feel their shoulders lower, not because a god has shouted, but because walls that fit and floors that are level and columns that keep promises teach the body to trust. A traveler will stand at the foot of a pyramid at dawn and watch the line of light climb its flank like a careful reader moving across a page. A mason will pass years later and touch a joint he set when he was young and find it still modestly perfect. The world is noisy elsewhere. Here, stone rests and people due to sleep now. Imagine the ramp smooth with water for tomorrow, the plumb bob waiting in the quiet, the barge rocking once in the dark, the copper edge just cool enough to remember how to be sharp in morning. The pyramid keeps its angle under moonlight. The temple keeps its breath. The quarry, for a few hours, is a wall emboldened by questions. At first light, the line will be snapped again. Work will begin as if for the first time, and continue as if it had never stopped. That is how we build anything meant to last. A temple begins each day before anyone sees it. Night air still clings to columns. Lizards write their tidy cursive across warm stone. The last stars hesitate above pylons whose edges have learned to hold light without dropping it. Then the first footfall arrives, the porter with a broom made of date palm ribs, a clay lamp cupped in his hand. He swabs the threshold because thresholds remember everything, and temples prefer to greet dawn clean. Inside the forecourt, silence stands like a companion who knows when not to speak. Pylons broad-shouldered come flank a doorway high enough to let wind pass without changing its mind. Flagstaffs, roped and patient, make a singing sound when morning tries its first breath. The lake square and orderly holds a circle of sky in its surface. Reeds at the edge do their precise work of filtering, whispering to frogs that it is time to be modest. Across the paving, yesterday's footprints have grown softer. The porter's broom convinces them to rest. Purity is practical before it is mystical. Priests come in from small rooms smelling faintly of natron and cool water. They have shaved head and body to make the day's tasks unstick from them, to keep stray hairs from worship, to keep the notion of fuss outside. In the hypostyle hall, where columns are a forest and shade is a language, they wash hands in a basin that makes a small globe out of water and then breaks it on purpose. Linen, the unarguable fabric, falls straight from shoulder to ankle with a dignity that does not need ornament. Sandals are left where stone begins to speak in the ancient dialect. Hieroglyphs carved, painted, renewed. The opening of the shrine is a ceremony of attention. The innermost room has kept dark since the last closing. Darkness is not a threat here, only a kindness to the God who lives by concentration. A priest carries a little lamp behind a hand to keep flame tame. Another carries a box with linen, unguent, a small mirror of polished copper, and a fan of feathers that has learned to be respectful. The door bolts are drawn with gentle metal noises. The door opens like a yawn that forgot to be rude. Inside, the cult statue waits, wood or stone gilded, not because God needs gold, but because gold is how light remembers itself on earth. There is no shouting. The first words are awakening, not command. Invitation, lid to eye, mirror to face, perfume to skin, linen to shoulder, fan to air. The God is washed and anointed, dressed and fed as a guest who has always lived here and will not move out. On a tray the offerings are small and exact: bread that broke with a sound, beer that remembers barley, onions split into perfect moons, lettuce crisp as truth, beef and fowl where the day allows. A scribe notes the list, not out of suspicion, but because gratitude likes a ledger. The God eats by idea. After a proper silence, the food is carried back out to be eaten by mouths that practice thanks with teeth. Nothing is wasted, nothing is hurried. Beyond the sanctuary, the temple's larger body wakes cell by cell in storerooms. The granary scribe runs his palm across baskets that kept their promise through the night. His reed pen tallies jars that remember oil as sunlight in another shape. In a cool chamber, linen hangs, bolts for dressing gods and tables, strips for bandaging and tying, cloth for cleaning what must be cleaned. Another room smells of resin and cedar. There, the incense is stored in glazed jars, frankincense that the dessert brought in exchange for patience, myrrh that once was sap and now is a vocabulary of smoke, kiffy compounded by recipe into a scent that teaches evening to be reasonable. In the forecourt the school opens like a small mouth learning to form letters. Boys on low stools, reed pens trimmed fine, practice on a struck earth's broken potter reborn as paper. A lector priest chants a line, the boys echo it. The line becomes a staircase the voice can climb. Neighbors arrive with questions. Day count for a vow, a dispute about a measure taken at dusk, a prayer they would like pronounced where stone has learned to listen. The temple is not only a house of gods, it is a library, a bank, a calendar, a lawyer, a weather office, a school, a stage, the sober center of a town's practical courage. Mid-morning brings the procession of breath. Sistrums wake a tangled sound of bronze that somehow stays gentle. A framed drum sets a pace that does not step on toes. The sacred bark, small thrown under carved canopy, is lifted on shoulders. Its painted eyes look where the street is. Headed people look back and recognize themselves as part of a sentence longer than their own houses. Incense persuades corners to smell like cedar and forgiveness. Children are allowed to seed but not to push. Their mother's hands know a language of wrists that keeps curiosity polite. At the quay the bark rests on a painted boat and slides into water the way a promise slides into memory. A ripple reaches the far bank and makes the fisherman glance up. The god has passed, the day is blessed in ordinary ways. When there is no feast, maintenance is worship. Men patch plaster where heat told the wall a joke. Women wash the pavement where sandals forgot themselves. A bull rubs oil on a door pivot until the door speaks in the correct tone again. A gardener cuts the lakes reeds into good manners. Palms are trimmed and the fronds stacked in neat fans for sweeping and for shade roofs near the kitchens. Dust is corrected with water and cloth. Birds are corrected with a clap and then forgiven. In a side court, a mason repaints the blue in a ceiling of stars. Kneeling on a plank scaffold he trusts more than he trusts tomorrow's weather. The kitchens behind the offering halls are a choreography of enough. Butchers sharpen, wash, portion. The knife's edge is a witness that holiness includes hygiene. Bakers slide trays of small loaves into domed ovens that remember yesterday perfectly. A boy fans the coals with a palm leaf fan as big as his torso. Brewers decant beer from vat to jar. Foam remembers it was once grain and stands where it should for a moment before yielding to lids and seals. A runner carries dishes toward the sanctuary with an ease that suggests he has done this since memory began. Another runner carries the leftovers in the opposite direction, towards storerooms where charity is measured quietly and sent back into town. Afternoon hush is the temple's best voice. In the hypostyle hall, columns as fat as trees hold up darkness that breathes cool. On their trunks, painted images remain themselves. King before God, God before offering, offering before altar, altar before people. The order is not a hierarchy that crushes. It is an ecosystem of courtesy. A few doves practice grace on a ledge. A stray cat allowed because mice should not study theology in granaries pads across a porch and sits where a patch of sun understands itself. A guard leans on a staff and dreams with his eyes open. The god remains in the shrine and nobody minds that nothing is happening because everything is happening. The town holds. The river keeps its appointment with the millimeter. The wind considers whether to rise before dusk. Temples keep time more gently than clocks. Bells are rare, conch and hand claps suffice. Shadows measure the floor. The steward of hours watches one narrow sunbeam step from column to column and calls for the evening lamps a little before anyone needs them, which is how kindness works. The lectern where papyrus rests receives a hymn voice alone, no show. The kind of melody you can fold and put in a pocket to chew on at night. Words are old and transparent. Praise for happy who keeps water honorable. Praise for Matt who keeps truth from fraying. Praise for a sun that remembers to return and a moon that remembers to be useful when the sun is stubborn. Visitors come who are not local. A caravan man who smells of resin and road asks for a blessing that will keep his camels from whining. A woman from a delta town brings a little faience amulet shaped like a pillar, sturdy thing, and asks that her son learn to sleep without fighting dreams. A fisherman offers a string of tilapia and seeks, in return, only the comfort of knowing that his daughter's cough is the sort that leaves. Priests listen more than they speak. They pour water over hands more often than over heads. They send people home with a bit of natron, a little oil. A practical instruction disguised as piety. Air the room at sunset. Boil the water, count your breaths when the anger comes, share the loaf even when the loaf is small. In the scribble house, documents stack like bricks, leases for temple fields, lists of hired labor for the next dredging of the canal, notes about a cracked lintel to be seen to after shamu. A recipe for kiffy corrected in the margin by a hand too honest to let a mistake migrate into the next generation. Students copy passages from the instruction of Tahatep, grinning at the line that advises patience with the hot-tempered. In the corner, a priest translates what the millimeter reading means for tithes this month. He is careful, because numbers are how fairness keeps its sandals outside. A woman waits under the shade with a jar. Her husband's name will be placed properly on a roll today. His back will be relieved of argument tomorrow. The temple does such things, slow miracles made of ink and attention. Evening shifts the temple from work into glow. Lamps appear like small planets in niches. The smell of kiffy rises, raisins, wine, honey, resins, herbs, all taught to become a smoke that is sweeter than its ingredients. The shrine is closed with a dignity that has learned not to weep. Bolts slide home, the god is left to rest, and so are people. In the court, a storyteller falls naturally into a myth while sweeping, Isis searching the marshes, Osiris remembering himself, Horus learning to fly while keeping one eye kind and one eye fierce. The children do not interrupt. They know the tale will reach them even if they pretend not to listen. Beyond the walls, an acropolis faces west, and the temple belongs to it as well. Priests of funerary rites step out with oils and bandages. They will receive a body, say the correct words, weigh a heart against the feather of mat in a symbolic scale, knowing that the real scales are the life lived and the kindness remembered. The temple lends perfume, linen, and legitimacy to grief. It also lends soup, which is a better theology at dusk than many sermons. When the family returns home, the temple keeps their names warm on papyrus, in mouths and prayers that are as practical as irrigation. Even temples sleep, though not as deeply as people. A night guard walks and counts along the colonnade 1, 2, 3, placing a small stone where his foot falls in case anyone doubts the carefulness of the watch at dawn. Bats revise insects away from lamps. Lizards patrol and sprints. An owl sits above the pylon and rehearses the lesson that quiet is a form of power. River air climbs the stair and cools the flagstones until they sigh. In the lake, a ripple writes itself into the corner and forgets its purpose, which is how rest should be. What is a temple for? When you remove grandeur from the equation and leave only use. It is for alignment, stone with star, offering with hunger, word with silence, person with person. It is for maintenance of walls, of stories, of fairness, of courage. It is for redistribution. Bread from God's table to human stomachs. Calm from a room of shadow to a lane of noise. Instruction from a papyrus to a boy's hand. It is for memory, so that when years are thin, people can say, "We have done this before and lived." By midnight, even the cats have agreed to be minor gods off duty. The last lamp in the sanctuary shelter goes out, not because oil has ended but because wisdom prescribes darkness where it is useful. The moon crosses the pylon's shoulder and rests briefly like a cartouche laid in light. Somewhere, a baby in town stirs and is comforted. A priest on his mat does not wake, but his breath keeps to the rhythm of the lake's little waves. The temple holds the night without clenching it. At first light, the porter will return with his broom and his lamp cup low. He will swab the threshold. He will approve the quiet. He will listen to the lake. He will open the small doors that have hinges which never squeak because oil is cheaper than embarrassment. He will nod to the god inside and to the geese outside and to the morning with its baskets of tasks. The temple will begin again, not as performance, but as habit made holy by repetition and good temper. If temples are the country's public breath, tunes are its private heartbeat. They sit in the west where the sun rests, neither morbid nor grandiose when seen from close by doors in rock. Courtyards patient with wind, low walls tracing rectangles that are more like fog than architecture. The living visit as easily as they visit the market. They bring bread and beer, onions and lotus, names and stories. The dead, who cannot eat, accept the scent and the words and the neatness of it all, and the living go home lighter, A tomb begins as a line drawn on stone with red ochre. A foreman of the workmen's village men whose hands know cliff and brush equally well sits a cord against limestone that has been sleeping since the last sea went home. The door is cut square and modest. A passage is smoothed roomies, coaxed from the heel with the same patience a miller uses with grain. In the shade of dear Almedina's narrow lanes, plants are pinned to walls or held in heads. A boy carries pigment pots. A man with a mallet taps, listens, until the wall agrees to be flat without becoming proud. Inside, the first breath of color arrives not from paint but from grids snapped across fresh plaster. Red lines the bones of proportion teach. Figures where to stand, how long a forearm is, how high a knee should rise, how a scribe's back should incline to his task. The draftsman sketches with reed pen a world that is both report and hope, fields that will always water themselves, a wife who always smiles even when onions are being peeled, a boat that always ignores contrary winds, a storehouse that always welcomes grain with fair scales. The carver follows, shallow relief that catches light gently. Then painters bring minerals to whisper, yellow that remembers desert sunlight, malachite green with the cool of shadows, red that recalls the first fire blue made by the alchemy of ground frit Egypt's own sky ground up and persuaded to live on walls. Scenes unfold like a long compound. Offering tables are set, bread loaves stacked into a geometry that satisfies the eye and the appetite. Harvest is shown at its most accurate, men cutting with sickles whose blades are optimistic crescent. Teeth, women binding sheaves with hands that know how to persuade straw to behave, children gleaning, honest and thorough. Fishing and fowling in marshes glance back at afternoons when the living escaped from lists and remembered that geese exist, to be admired as well as eaten. Banquet scenes are careful to keep dignity, chairs straight, perfumes perched in cones that sweeten air, musicians poised with harp and flute. The dead couple sits, young forever, accepting flowers that never bruise. On a lintel, a line of hieroglyphs conducts a household prayer, a formula as formal as it is kind, asking passerby to speak the name aloud. An offering which the king gives, the words begin, and though kings are far away, the grammar lets gifts flow, bread and beer, beef and fowl, alabaster and linen, 1,000 of everything, and then sly and perfect, as many as the sky, as the Nile, as the riverbanks, as the desert, which is another way of saying enough. To read such a line softly is to send a small boat of food into the next room. To trace the carved name with a finger is to polish it with the oil of today's breath. The false door in a chapel wall is a polite contradiction, a door that will not open and yet is the most used thurs. Hold in the room, the living place offerings. Before it, the caw of the departed emerges through it to participate in the day's good manners. The shelf receives bread, onions, beer. A cup of cool water poured slow so the sound writes its own prayer. A girl wipes the slab with a damp cloth, and the stone darkens like a satisfied brow. A boy, allowed to hold the jar, tilts it carefully, a little spills and no one scolds. Names are spoken correctly twice. The air approves. Beyond the chapel, corridors may turn, the chamber may widen. A ceiling may be dotted with stars patiently, repeated by a painter who learned that repetition is not boredom, it is devotion. In royal tombs, passages drop into the earth's deliberate breath. Walls thick with spells that teach the king how to recognize gates, and guardians how to name. The sky boats, how to sail under the belly of Nut to the morning shore. The solar bark floats along painted rivers that are both night and time. Stars are drawn as 5-pointed stitches fastening the heavens to rock. In humbler tombs, the spells are shorter, but the purpose is the same, to make comfort administratively certain. The opening of the mouth ritual performed at the funeral, remembered in pictures, gives the dead back their senses. A priest touches a ritual adze to lips and eyes, ears and nose. reciting words practical as medicine. May you breathe, may you see, may you hear, may you eat. A calf's leg is lifted, a symbol of energy returning to joints. Incense makes it tidy. Column of forgiving smoke. Tools are precise, movements unhurried. The audience neighbors mostly follows without fidgeting. Ritual here is craft. It works because it is done properly and often. Tunes accumulate equipment like well-run kitchens. The shabti small servant figurines stand in ranks with hose and baskets, sleepy-eyed and willing. Should a call come from the fields of reeds you there, report for canal clearing the little ones answer on the owner's behalf with a cheerful, we will. Canopic jars it under guardian stare, amulets tie it. Heart scarab are placed where story and anatomy agree they are most effective. A headrest carved from wood or stone waits like a crescent moon for a neck that has earned comfort. For the wealthy, a painted coffin nestles inside a painted coffin, nested like promises. For the poor, a reed mat, a simple box, and the exact same names spoken with the exact same care. Outside, in the workman's village, life goes on with the friendly bureaucracy of creation. Pay lists on a stockase who worked which day, who was excused for a funeral, who borrowed lamp oil and repaid it, who brought a complaint about a foreman's temper that the scribe wrote down without sarcasm. Loans of grain are recorded and forgiven in thin years. Jars of beer are tallied to keep equality from becoming envy. Tool rations, copper chisels, mallet heads. New rope are distributed with fairness that gossips about itself until it becomes tradition. A man scolds his son for wasting a brush. The boy runs an errand and returns solemn, holding pigment like a sacrament. The necropolis road learns slow parades on a day of burial. Women lead with measured wails, music that airs grief so it will not rot. Men follow carrying the bier, steps in time with a drum that has heard this tempo all its life. Priests with collars of flowers and clean linen spiral to the west. At the tomb, the last rites are practical, sealing, placing a final list of offerings spoken carefully so the record is accurate. The mourners sit in shade and eat. Food is shared with a generosity that defeats loneliness. Children watch and learn to equal truths, that death is certain, that company is a remedy. Afterwards, the tomb is not abandoned to silence. Families return on feast days and on days that are not feasts, when a son receives a job, when a baby's name is spoken, when a quarrel has been resolved and thanks needs to be placed somewhere cooler than the house. Bread is set down, beer poured, names said. The ground between chapels becomes a neighborhood where the living and the dead keep an old, courteous conversation going. The West Bank is full without being crowded. Craft continues as long as cliffs permit. A painter refines a lotus petals line with a sigh that might be satisfaction, might be the day loosening its sandals. A carver corrects a hieroglyph's beak so that the ibis will not be insulted by a clumsy profile. A scribe, amused by a proverb, tucks it in the margin where it will comfort some future reader's eyes. A lamp is trimmed. A ladder is moved. A boy is told to sweep more gently because dust has earned respect as much as color has. In the distance, a donkey brays in a tone that says he disagrees with load distribution. A man laughs and rearranges baskets. Even the royal valley, with its deeper passages and discreet guards, shares the same pedestrian holiness. Watchmen nap in the heat with practice and wake when they need to. A mason drives a copper chisel into limestone and hears music no instrument could produce. An overseer worries about a cracked ceiling and worries also about his daughter's cough. He can do something about the ceiling. He takes notes on an ostracon. Prop timber, check tomorrow. The cough will be soothed with mint and patience and the midwife's kindness. Work and life refuse to be enemies. At dusk, the western cliffs hold light like bowls. The faces of tomb doors glow briefly, then cool. Families gather their baskets and fold mats. A priest wipes the offering table as carefully as a mother wipes a child's face. The names written on door jambs are not lonely. They have been stroked by fingers, cleaned with water, refreshed with words. D's cross the sky in a script that no one reads aloud because everyone knows it already. The Nile shushes the day, the desert agrees to sleep, night in the necropolis is orderly. A guard's staff ticks a slow measure on stone as he walks the path he walked yesterday and will walk tomorrow. Lizards send tiny messages across warm plaster and forget them at once. Stars sprinkle their forgiveness on cliffs that remember seas. The moon explores lintels with cool logic. Somewhere a jar sighs as the air inside learns the night's mathematics. In a chapel, a little of the kiffy clings from the last feast, mixing with the smell of limestone and wheat flour brought accidentally on a sleeve. It is enough. Perfume for the dead and more than enough for the day. What do these tombs teach aside from endurance? That memory is a craft, not only a feeling. That names survive when they are spoken and dusted. When bread is placed and divided. When walls are painted and repaired. When grief is aired and fed. That the afterlife, imagined properly, is not a startlingly different country but a perfected village. Canals that behave, fields that yield, tools that do not sulk, company that never runs thin. That justice, even here, is a fair scale, a straight measure, a list kept honestly, net measured in cubits, and kindness. If you sleep now, it will be near a house that someday will be remembered with the same neatness. A name correctly said, a loaf set down, a jar poured slowly, a slab wiped with a damp cloth. The west will hold you like a cool hand holds a warm one. The east will promise morning between them. The river will continue to carry offerings in both directions, from the living to the dead in Basque. Peace, from the dead to the living in courage. The cliffs will not move. The stars will come when they should. The work will be waiting in the kindest possible way. Long before stone was persuaded to remember kings, there was a softer miracle in Egypt, the moment when sound learned to sit down. A scribe bent over a sheet the color of sand after rain, dipped a reed into a small well of black that smelled faintly of smoke and gum, and drew a line. The line was a river no boat would ever cross, and yet whole villages could travel on it. Writing here was not noise, it was breath that had agreed to endure. Morning opens the house of life, a quiet set of rooms near a temple wall where papyrus waits in rolls, pallets lie like slim boats with too little lakes of ink, and reed pens sleep in bundles tied with cord. A porter sweeps the threshold because words prefer clean shoes. In the inner room, a scribe lifts a roll whose fibers run two ways, one for vertical strength, one for horizontal patience, and weighs it in his hand the way a baker weighs dough. He tests a reed against a shard. The nib needs a gentler cut. A knife as small as a promise trims the tip. A thumbnail presses the slit. The reed is ready to become sound. Ink is modest alchemy. Black is soot married to water and gum, the dust of last night's lamps persuaded to behave. Red is earth, red ochre ground fine, used for headings and warnings, for names of gods, and for beginnings. The color of attention. In a shallow dish, he wakes the black with a few drops, and a circle of the brush. In another, the red. His palette to wells, a flat rail, a groove for pens fits his hand as if it came with the hand. He touches reed to black. The point shines like a tiny evening dot. The students arrive with the hush of boys who know both pride and fear. They sit on low stools. A writing board is propped on a neat plastered smooth, and reused until stories and lists blur into a friendly ghost under the fresh white. Today's copy is an old wisdom. Be gentle when you speak. The angry man's word is wind, they chant. First voice teaching hand what rhythm to catch, then write. The master pauses with a reed held like a small reed branch of permission. He corrects by breathing a little through his nose, by erasing with a damp cloth, and patience, by showing. The letter begins slowly, as if drawing it from the air. The satire of the trades is copied on other days, its cheerful argument that the scribe's life is cleaner than a tanner's. lighter than a mason's, which everyone knows is only half true, and therefore good advice. Respect labor, but also learn the read. By mid-morning, the house is a workshop of memory. One scribe counts jars for the granary clerk, entering numbers in neat columns that step like soldiers, and never trip. Grain in, grain out, loaves owed, loaves paid, another drafts, a lease for a strip of field, lines and witnesses, and a date that the Nile's level will confirm. A third copies a hymn for tomorrow's procession, the rubric in red and the verses in black, leaving small pauses like stones in a shallow river so the voice can step across without getting wet. A boy fetches water and learns to walk as if the jar and he are old friends. Papyrus making is happening to courtyards away. Stalks are stripped to pale ribbons. The rind curls back like a smile. Strips are laid in a lattice one direction, then the other pressed with stone and sun until fibers, persuaded, make treaty. The sheet dries under a board with a weight that remembers last season's taxes. When lifted, it sighs like a door. Opening, someone polishes it with a smooth stone until the surface learns to be polite to ink. The smell is faintly green like a sentence you could live in. Not all writing is on rolls. Chipped a struck of yesterday's, broken jar made into today's. Paper pile like river pebbles on a scribe's table. Here are quick notes, a message to an uncle upriver, a list of onions and leeks, a receipt for a borrowed net. A draft of a letter to the dead asking a grandmother to intervene in a neighbor's stubbornness. On the back of another shard, the child's first attempt at a bird sign looks more like a basket, but the master nods as if a bird might indeed look like that in a generous world, and shows the correct beak again. In the temple school, statues are the best behaved students. A lector priest sings the older texts on a beat that helps memory stick. Long vowels like dessert shade, short ones like the flash of ibis wings. Boys write hieratic, the quick cursive that serves bread and beer. Realities, the master keeps a ceremonial read for full hieroglyphs, slow and formal, that will go to stone. Sometimes he lets a student hold that read for the feel of solemn ink in the hand. The boy trembles, draws a falcon beak that almost pleases Horace, and hands the reed back with a sigh and a vow that feels suspiciously like a prayer. Beyond the house, writing crawls outward like irrigation. In the office of the Nilometer, a figure notes the morning's mark on the stair and ties it to last week's, and to the smell of the river and to the way the frogs have behaved. He writes the sum on a roll that will become a policy, a tithe, a fair share, a warning not to boast this year. In the market, a scribe sits with a basket of ostraka and a brush. Women and men come with small commerce to be made into small law. He sold, she paid, witness saw. The brush clicks softly on clay. In the workman's village, a foreman dictates who carried basket, and who chipped stone, and who was sent home because a child had fever. Ink makes fairness stick where memory might otherwise smudge. At noon, the house rests, reeds lie in their groove. Inkwells coat their own rims against drying. A roll waits under a weight. Bread is eaten without mathematics. Beer is sipped with the courtesy of those who speak with their throats for a living. The courtyard. Palm gives one more coin of shade and keeps the sun from being greedy. A cat climbs onto a folded mat and studies the letter for cat, which looks like a seated feline, and decides that it is accurate enough for government work. Afternoon returns with stone. In a shaded hall near the temple court, a draftsman snaps a red grid on fresh plaster, squares flower across a wall like a garden of measure. He sketches in hieroglyphs, all reed leaf, folded cloth, water ripple signs that are also small paintings. A carver follows with shallow relief, teaching shadows where to live. A painter brings blues and greens that used to be stone and will be stone again, but brighter. The scribe checks spellings the way a mason checks level. A miscut name is no lighter than a mislaid block. He runs the reed across his pond to adjust its mood, corrects a falcon's eye with a breath, smiles when the determinative at a word's end sits as if it belongs there. Writing is a team sport. On a bench, a young scribe copies a page of Tahotep's counsel. Do not be proud of your knowledge. Converse with the ignorant man as with the learned. His hand stumbles unproud. He rests, sips water, resumes. The master murmurs a proverb with the weight of a hand on a shoulder. The reed writes better after it has been turned in the fingers. The boy turns the reed, the letter behaves. The master, who has seen this miracle for decades, still enjoys it as if it were new. In corners and at thresholds, women with literacy household scale write names on jars, marks on baskets, prayers no book has taught them. A mother with a neat hand labels a pot for lentils, so a sleepy child will not season the wrong stew. A weaver chalks a design on the warp beam, a set of diamonds that will appear as if by spell when the shuttle plays its game. A healer notes in tiny signs how much honey and how much oil soothe which cough, and folds the note into the small jar with the spare amulet. When people say scribes, they often mean men with palates. The country knows better. Memory lives wherever hands learn to draw breath into lines. At the age of evening, the house of life writes its own long exhale. Rolls are wrapped and tied with cords that have learned the correct stiffness. Ink is capped with the easy lids of leaves and stones, and the palette is wiped until it gleams like a small, well-kept boat. Reed pens are slid into a case thin, wooden, practical, that will hang from a shoulder tomorrow as if it were a limb. A clerk seals a jar with clay and impresses a seal ring scarab on top, name beneath so that the jar will keep its promise. Overnight, he taps the seal twice, gently, as if to wish the clay good dreams. Night does not erase writing, it illuminates it differently. In a room no larger than a cart, a lamp makes a circle of light where a scribe copies a hymn for a festival 3 days hence. The words rise as he writes them, the way steam rises from a bowl. Praise to you, happy, who comes to nourish the land. His reed whispers on papyrus. The cat's tail moves like a slow metronome. The lamp complains once, and then agrees to behave outside. The Nile practices its cursive on black water with white letters that are called stars. No one complains when a syllable falls into the river. The river remembers everything. What does the scribe's craft do, besides paperwork? It tenders reality. It lets a measure be fair after sunset. It lets a promise survive a storm. It lets a story walk to a far village and still be itself. It lets a priest call a god by name without guessing. It lets a boy write to a dead grandmother and believe she can read him, which is the kind of belief that keeps a town from breaking when it could bend. It takes breath brief, warm, vanishing, and convinces it to stay. Before sleep, the master sets his palette where he will reach it without groping in the morning. His dreams are tidy, a line straight, a column that totals correctly. A child who suddenly understands the falcon eye, a day when the reed did not splinter at the last word. The goddess of letters, patient, exact, smiles without moving. Somewhere in a basket, a new bundle of reeds dries, preparing to become future mornings. The house of life sleeps with its doors thinking of hinges, and its walls thinking of words. Dawn knows where to find it. If the house of life is where words learn to breathe, the rest of Egypt is where they learn to work. The reed that drew a hymn in the morning will, by afternoon, tally jars, soothe quarrels, hire boats, certify borders, remember debts, forgive some, and insist on others. It will write to kings and bakers, to gods and cousins, to the far-off and the newly born. Nothing in Egypt moves very far without a shadow of ink walking beside it. The day begins with measures. In a granary court, 2 men lift a hacket, scoop wooden, rub smooth by ears, while a scribe watches a balance whose tongue hangs straight as conscience. Grain pours with a sound like soft rain on a roof. A line of dots and little circles grows into numbers on a straka. In outhold paid. The measure's honesty is public. set on a low platform where anyone can look, the way a promise should be placed on the wall. A cubit wrought notched wood rests within reach, ready to make walls true, canals fair, lows correct. Egypt does not despise mathematics, it treats it like water, prayer, shared and life-giving. Ink here wears its work, clothes hieratic, the quick, flowing script that lets a hand keep up with the day. On a plank across to jars, a scribe bends and writes, a lease for a little strip along the ditch, a receipt for a goat sold with one horn imperfect, and therefore discounted but wholesome. A higher note for a ferry to crossings at dawn too. At dusk, grain to be delivered north by the 4th day of Shamu. He uses red to begin, black to continue, silence to conclude. Witnesses offer names, which the reed catches and makes stay. Each letter is a kindness to memory. A few streets away, the vizier's court receives the morning. Petitioners sit on a low wall, cooling themselves with folded cloths, turning over their words until they are ready to be spoken without breaking. Scribes move like quiet fish in a pool, brushing light across the surface and leaving senses where ripples have just been. A woman presents a petition. Her neighbor narrowed a path with a wall that remembers nothing of right measure. Her words are respectful as a bowl set down. The scribes read copies them with the same weight they had in the mouth. The vizier will hear. He will send a man with a rod and a cord to walk the path, to ask the wall and the ground for the truth. When the decision comes, it will be written as well as spoken, so tomorrow can find it. In the market, law happens with a broom in one hand. A market scribe settles under an awning. Sellers bring onions, figs, fish, bolts of linen, jars that pretend not to leak and then confess. Buyers arrive with coins, loaves, promises. The scribe keeps prices from wandering, weights from fibbing, measures from growing generous with friends. A jar stopper is sealed with damp clay and a scarab stamp, whirl of beetle, name of owner, and a swift drying in the sun make certainty firm. When a dispute grumbles, the scribe writes its bones and the neighbors supply its muscles and skin. And the thing walks away not as a quarrel but as an agreement. At the millimeter, a priest with a pen that knows courtesy records the morning's height not alone, but beside yesterday's, and next to the memory of last year's, and in light of frogs, reeds, the snow that carries from far up river when the Ethiopian rains have done their duty. The figure polite, modest travels on papyrus to the places where grain will be requested or released, where tithes will be nudged up or down, where canal gangs will be hired early or allowed to sleep a week more. Numbers here are not tyranny. They are advice. In a clerk's dark, cool room, archives breathe carefully. Papyrus rolls are tied with cords and tagged with little lines in red, subject, date, who wrote, who witnessed. Some are folded and sleep in jars, others lie in chests whose lids have learned to fit. A mouse once ventured here and left again bored. A seal ring scarab over a name presses clay into agreement. And the bullion strings look like little moons. When a scribe pulls a roll and aunties it, the room smells faintly of green places and gum. A case is found, an old boundary ruling from the reign of a king whose names now live only in stone, and in rooms like this and today's, quarrel learns humility. Not everything official is severe. A scribe, fetched to a house where a baby has decided on existence, writes the name on a potsherd, slow as if the letters were being stitched into air. Later, he will add the same name to a temple roll so the child will be counted in the prayers that count. In the evening, he will copy a lullaby into a spare corner of a wisdom text for a friend, because ink is cheaper than sleep, and sometimes better. His palate picks up the smell of sesame oil from the lamp, and tomorrow he will wipe it clean with a sigh that says he knows better. Messages travel. A courier with a sealed roll goes down river. The cool jar at his hip wrapped in damp cloth. He carries news like bread. The flood level. The date of the next procession. A summons for a mason whose wall survived this year's rains too well, and will be examined to learn why. Another courier goes upriver, carrying a letter to a sister. We are well, the figs were sweet, mother's cough is less. Send the jar from the second shelf, the one that doesn't argue. He will stop for shade and read the address again to himself, because names are company on a hot path, on the royal road of foreign things. A different script sometimes steps in. At the palace archives of a king where walls smell of cedar, and ink diplomatic letters arrive on clay, impressed with wedge marks in Akkadian. The language that many courts have agreed to call peace by, an Egyptian scribe who learned both birds and reeds and wedges and lines sits with a damp sponge and a patient face and reads a prince's complaint about gold that was promised and arrived reluctant. He composes an answer polite as bread, firm as stone. Another clerk copies it on papyrus in hieratic for the king's eyes, and then on clay for distant ones. Egypt speaks several tongues when it must. In ink it keeps its accent, in clay it understands. Others, the workman's village where tombs are cut and painted, keeps its own bureaucracy of the ordinary sublime. On a day board, a scribe notes absences with a frankness that has taught history how people actually lived. With the scribe, with the wife sick, brewing beer, wrapping a mother, bitten by a scorpion, making offerings, fetching stone, rations, paid in bread and beer, are listed with the tidiness that prevents envy from remembering how to sneak in. When a man borrows oil for a lamp, he returns it with thanks and a mark. When he does not, the mark glows a little until a neighbor teases him into remembering. In law, words behave like rope. They bind and they pull straight. A deposition about a damaged wall is taken in a cool doorway. The scribe writes what is said, not what he thinks. He knows the difference. He notes witnesses. He draws a little plan. Half wall. Ditch, tree with 3 trunks. Distance in cubits measured not with guesses, but with knotted cord. Later the vizier will read and say exactly how much mud must be moved, and by whom and by when. No metaphor is needed. The wall will learn the correct shape again because the sentence said so. Love slips between columns on a sheet left over from accounts. A young man copies lines from a poem that has embarrassed and delighted boys for generations. My beloved's voice is oak shade in noon heat. Her step is a little wind in barley. He miscopies a sign and laughs at himself and fixes it. Desire forgives handwriting elsewhere. A girl ties a crushed lotus in a damp twist of linen and presses it between papyrus sheets because pressed things keep their color. Later she writes a line for herself, 3 words only, and folds the scrap into her bead box, which will keep it safe as long as safety is needed. Scribes do medicine as well as math. In a small room where the light arrives politely, a medical papyrus lies open, remedies numbered, ingredients named and measured, cautions noted, prayers added, not because the physician distrusts garlic or honey or willow, but because bodies answer to several languages, and one of them is praise. For a burn, cool water, honey, lint; for a cough, date, onion; beer for sorrow, company. He writes slowly and leaves generous margins. Another hand later will add a note that begins, I tried, and the script grows more personal until it is almost a letter to the next physician who will try to. In the caravanserai where incense and copper sing different songs, a scribe lists loads, bags of myrrh, logs of cedar, rings of copper, skins of oil, bundles of linen, ingots measured in deben, each marked against a name. He records beasts, camels drooling philosophy, donkeys resigned to absurdity. He notes who brought what, who lost a sandal, who laughed too loud, and was forgiven. If anything is missing, the list will say so without cruelty. Because lists should be honest and people should be spared where possible, afternoon letters to the dead are written in the quiet behind each us, on a broken sherd that used to pour water, and will now be poured into by words. Grandmother, so-and-so has been unkind about a strip of field. Please remind Justice how to behave. The writer places the sherd at a tomb niche with a little bread and beer. speaks the names correctly twice, and goes home feeling less alone. The scribe who wrote more complicated things today sees this ceremony and is satisfied. Not everything needed him, and that is healthy. As shadows lengthen, accounts meet stories. A clerk copies the tale of the eloquent peasant, where a farmer's words win back what was taken from him. He smiles when the judge finally listens. Across town, a boy traces the first lines of the story of sinew and discovers that homesickness can be written down and still leave room to breathe. When lamps are lit, the reed writes the day's last numbers, how many jars, how many loaves, how many hands, and then writes a blessing over them as if numbers, too, need a roof to sleep under. Evening files everything. Seals are pressed small. Circles of clay remember the pressure of a god's name in a beetle's back and dry to confidence. Rolls are tied, titles written on outside wrappers. Palettes are wiped with a last, tidy stroke. Reeds go to their case, points up, like a stand of reeds along a bank, and the room exhales. A cat sneaks in, and is not evicted. Mice are littered, too, and must be argued with. Night returns speech to breath. A scribe on his mat counts a few mat truths on his fingers before sleep. I wrote what was said, I measured what was there. I kept a promise on behalf of someone who could not write their own. I made the day lighter for a stranger by making their words stand upright. The Nile says something soft to the bank. A wind issues a brief memo through palm leaves. Stars look like points of red ink correcting the sky where it tried to be too dark. What does this empire of paperwork accomplish? It tames luck without insulting it. It stores kindness where it can be found later. It teaches fairness how to walk unaccompanied. It lets memory travel and arrive whole. It binds neighbors without knots, guides water without shouting, feeds the hungry without speeches, soothes the angry with a sentence that fits. The re is a small thing, its shadow is very long. Sleep now. Imagine a roll tied just snug enough, a seal cooling, an account that ends on a line without crowding, a petition folded for morning, a love note kept under beads, a medicine measured and waiting. A fairy list rolled and slipped into a sash. The lamp is turned with 2 fingers. The wick agrees. In the quiet, the day's words lay their heads down in a row and breathe together. Dawn will wake them gently. Hieroglyphs look like pictures because they remember that they were once pictures, but they behave like language because they learned courtesy. A bird on a wall is not only a bird. It may be a sound, a word, a warning at the end of a word. What scribes call a determinative, the small, silent judge that tells you whether a coil of rope means to bind or a measure, whether a man walking means to go or simply reminds you that the word belongs to human things. The script can face left or right. You read toward the faces, because reading is a kind of meeting. A line of water ripples says, and softly, an owl says, and without hooting. A seated man at the end says, in effect, this is about people. The page is a tidy street where every sign knows its house. Learning this grammar is a slow kindness to the mind, in the school attached to the house of life. The master lays out sign lists the way a cook lays out ingredients. Birds together, tools together, parts of the body in an order a body would agree with. A student copies each with read and patience, then copies a line that uses 2, then 3. Then many learning how signs get along. Red marks begin a column, black continues it, empty space rests it. The master corrects the shape of a falcon's beak with a fingertip, the length of a reed leaf with a sound that is almost a laugh, the angle of a water ripple with a breath. Error is not scolded. It is smoothed. When the hand behaves, the mind is invited to widen. Wisdom texts arrive like old relatives with good manners. The instruction of Tahatep speaks softly about proportion. Do not interrupt an angry man. Do not hoard praise from a good worker. Do not let your tongue be long and your ear short. The instruction of a Menemope adds its own steady counsel. Move boundaries back to where they belong. Do not take a poor man's cloak. Better a little with a quiet heart than plenty with a noisy one. Boys chant the lines. Men copy them into the margins of their days. Words become tools and habits lighter than stone, stronger than rope. At the other end of the shelf live tales that make the evening sit closer to the lamp. The shipwrecked sailor tells of a man welcomed by a talking serpent who knows the mathematics of consolation. Sinew discovers that exile tastes of both fear and figs, and that home has a smell you cannot mix in a jar. The eloquent peasant teaches that a straight sentence can lift a crooked law back onto its feet. These stories are not escapes from the world, they are ways to hold it without clenching it. A scribe copies the lines for a neighbor's boy and smiles at the part where the judge finally listens. Between hymns and tales sit the lists apparently humble, and yet the joints on which certainty swings. Word lists that keep categories honest. Festival calendars that teach spring where to stand in the year, supply rosters that make loaves and jars equivalent to promises, star tables that let the night be a clock, a ceiling painted with decans, small groups of stars rising one after another through darkness lets a priest count the hours even when the sun has gone elsewhere to work. A star clock on a coffin lid promises the sleeper that the heavens will take their shift watching while the village sleeps. Numbers have their own handwriting on a wooden board rubbed with gesso. Someone has copied problems the way a good baker copies recipes, to divide 10 loaves into an equal but fair shares. 2. Calculate the volume of a granary shaped like a truncated cone, to find the slope of a ramp that will not shame oxen. The student works in unit fractions, taking wholes and teaching them to be generous. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8 pieces that add up properly if you are polite with them. The word for the slope of a pyramid sect is written with the ease of the familiar. How many handbreadths the face runs out for each cubit of rise. Geometry here is not a theorem shouted at the sky. It is a chord with knots spaced like music, stretched by rope stretchers after the flood to persuade fields to remember their edges. Those rope stretchers, practical magicians, walk in pairs at pert when the land has put on green. Again, one holds the cubit rod, notched and confident, another keeps the knotted cord true. They pace a boundary, remeasure a path that a wall forgot, reset a corner where a ditch told a small lie. The scribe follows, ink ready, writing a plan that is not simply lines and angles but also a treaty among neighbors. When they finish, they pour a little water to the ground, not as a sacrifice, but as thanks their earth has been reasonable again. Medicine keeps its own shelves of senses that have learned to heal. On a papyrus open to the page where burns are treated, the script moves in 3 modes: observation, what is seen and felt; prescription, what to do and how much; prayer, who to invite into the room besides the physician. Honey is set on a wound because bees do chemistry as a hobby. Willow is steeped for pain because trees have their own experiments, and we have paid attention. Natron cleans because the dessert knows how to keep rot humble. The scribe writes these things in lines as calm as a basin, with margins generous enough to accept a later hand's note. Tried this with a boy of 9. Worked better with more honey. Praise to THOTH. Not all writers sit in schools, in kitchens and workshops. House signs and shop marks keep goods and families from confusion. A woman literate in the way a household must be writes a label on a jar so onions do not become figs in the dark. A weaver chalks diamonds on a warp beam, and later the cloth obediently remembers them. A boatman marks his name with a little fish beside it on his oar blade, not to boast, but to make friendliness easy when oars get mixed at the quay. Writing exists at many altitudes. The air between them is busy and kind. A library in this age is a few rooms with cool walls, chests that close well, and a man or woman who can find what you need. Rolls are kept in lids or sleeves, sometimes in jars, each with a neat label folded around the outside. Title, subject, shelf. A borrower is a friend with obligations. A roll is lent to be copied. It returns a little thicker with a new colophon at the end, copied faithfully from the good exemplar in the House of Life. May Thoth lengthen the life of the scribe who wrote, and the one who reads. Errors are corrected not with embarrassment but with ceremony. A small red dot, a marginal bird, a line in the colophon that says, I fixed where the earlier hand forgot a single reed leaf in the word for water. May that hand forgive me as I forgive him. In such ways, texts travel centuries without becoming strangers to themselves. The aesthetics of writing are practical before they are pretty. A good column is justified its right edge tidy, its left edge breathing. A heading in red is a flag without a shout. A rubric that begins a hin is a door at which you pause to wipe your feet before entering. A scribe turns his reed with a knife no longer than a finger. The cut makes a tiny V that trains ink to be generous, but not foolish. He keeps a bit of leather for wiping, a shard for testing. A second reed with a wider mouth, for large letters, that need to be seen across a room. He oils the palettes wood so it will not splinter into the walls where black and red must be kept safe. Sometimes ink walks from page to stone. A draftsman snaps a red grid on a temple wall. The scribe pencils the sequence of signs. The carver follows. The painter returns with color that will withstand weather longer than any single throat can sing. The scribe stands back and checks a cartouche royal name bound with an oval like a good belt-bandage. Uses a falcon's eye so that the god will not feel slighted by a lazy curve. Language passes from reed to chisel and does not lose its grammar. The wall becomes a book that can be read even when the House of Life sleeps. Egypt speaks other scripts in other rooms. For speed and daily life, hieratic moves like a river that knows its banks. In later centuries, another hand demotic, quick, and economical will take over receipts and letters with a competence that does not ask for applause. The state will keep its inscriptions ceremonial and hieroglyphs because ceremony asks for dress. Households and courts and docks will use faster hands because bread and boats have schedules. The country never forgets that all three are one river, with many channels. The ethics of the reed are simple and not easy. Write what was said, measure what is there, do not sharpen your pen on another person's dignity. Let numbers be kind without becoming lazy. Let names be spelled correctly because a crooked name is a crooked road. When a scribe finishes an account, he sometimes draws a small sign of met the feather of truth at the bottom, not as decoration, but as a compact. This balances. He sleeps better when that feather has been earned. There are days when ink meets rain rare, but Reland the librarian lifts rolls into higher jars and smiles at the drama of water trying to read. There are days when the wind flips a page and a line of him breaks across two sheets and must be healed with a neat paste. There are days when a mouse attempts literacy by nibbling and is caught by a cat who believes in critique. The House of Life repairs what can be repaired, recopies what must be recopied, and lays the old sheet in a chest where faded words continue to do their work for anyone who has learned to read PALANESS. At night, the astronomer scribe climbs steps to a roof above the hypostyle hall and leans his back against a warm stone. He has a mercat, a plumb line on a stick, and a sighting tool like a small ladder of wood. He sets a north-south line by a star that never leaves. He waits. He notes when Subdet rises. When certain decans crest the horizon, how long a lamp burns. To measure a watch. His notes are not romance, they are useful. When to call the procession, when to expect the flood, when to begin the fast before the festival, when to wake the baker. He writes the sky down so that people can lift their heads less often and still be in step with it. There are letters that go nowhere and still arrive. Letters to the dead are written on pottery and tucked into niches with bread and beer and correct names. Petitions to gods are written and left in a wall's crack near a chapel door, folded small under a stone. Love notes are hidden in bead boxes. lullabies in the corner of wisdom texts, jokes in the margins of accounts where only a friend will find them. Writing is a public utility and a private grace. It keeps a state coherent and a marriage amused. It helps a child sleep and a judge remember. It puts a boundary back where the flood was tempted to forget. Now and then, the scribe looks up from his board and simply listens. The house of life is quiet but not silent. Brushes whisper. A student recites. Outside, a rope creaks on a well. Farther off, a temple door sighs in its hinge. Near the window, a palm frond ticks against a lintel and corrects the afternoon's heat. He dips the reed, writes one more line, and lets it dry just long enough to keep its shape for 100 years. He ties a roll with cord that has learned to be exactly the right tightness, not strangling, not lazy. He stamps a seal that will break with a satisfying sound next spring when the same hymn is needed, and someone's breath will meet it again. What do hieroglyphs and their swift cousins teach besides facts? That order can be gentle and still hold, that beauty can be useful and still smile, that truth has a feather and a balance, and both belong at the bottom of a page as much as on the walls of a court, that a village can remain a village when it has a memory better than any single person's, that time itself can be persuaded to step into lines and wait with good manners until someone needs it. Sleep now. The palette is wiped, the reeds are laid in their groove. The rolls are nested like birds. In the next room, a student dreams he finally drew the perfect O. In this one, the master dreams of a column that adds without borrowing down the lane. A mother dreams she wrote her child's name correctly, and the name smiled outside. The now writes a long sentence on the dark, and the stars make their red punctuation marks where the night tried to be too much. In the morning, the house of life will open its door and begin again with a broom, a reed, a line, a breath.